Sudden absence of people. You are walking down a bustling street. Cafe humming with conversation, cars weaving through traffic, the chatter of pedestrians layered with the occasional bark of a dog. And then, in a heartbeat, the energy evaporates. The voices are gone, the cars seem to vanish, the crowd thins until you are alone, standing in a scene that moments ago was teeming with life. The sidewalks are empty, the chairs unoccupied, the world reduced to its skeletal architecture. Buildings, pavement, trees, lampposts, and the eerie silence of absence. The sudden disappearance of people when it happens is disorienting because it violates expectations of continuity, social rhythm, and temporal flow. The environment has changed, but not incrementally. The shift is instantaneous, like someone hit a pause button on the choreography of everyday life. The mind struggles to interpret it. It's oscillating between explanations that are environmental, neurological, social, and metaphysical. At the first layer lies perception and attention. The human visual system relies on motion and density cues to detect crowds and activity. When attention is focused narrowly, perhaps on a phone, a conversation, or a distant landmark, the periphery can fail to register rapid shifts in population density. Coupled with saccadic suppression, the brain may overlook subtle departures until the gap becomes noticeable, making the change appear sudden rather than gradual. The more chaotic the environment, the greater the chance that motion-based predictive coding will create the illusion of continuity where none exists. When the real departures coincide with moments of inattentiveness, the brain's reconstruction of events smooths over the intermediate states, producing the feeling that everyone disappeared at once. Environmental and structural factors play a role as well. Many sudden absences occur in spaces that have natural choke points. Subway stations, corridors, plazas, or narrow streets. A crowd leaving through a few exits can create a perceptual illusion of emptiness, especially when viewed from a vantage that obscures the remaining people. Timing is critical. Coordinated movements like the end of a lunch rush, the closing of a store, or synchronized breaks in a school or office can create a fleeting desertion that seems instantaneous. Lighting, shadows, and architectural cues amplify the effect. Bright sunlight on one side of a building or the sudden flicker of indoor lights can momentarily hide movement, further enhancing the sense of abrupt absence. The social dimension is inseparable from the perceptual. Humans are social trackers. We constantly monitor and predict the behavior of crowds and individuals. We anticipate density, direction, and pace. When these expectations are violated, even briefly, the cognitive dissonance is striking. An area that should be populated according to habit suddenly fails to meet those expectations, creating a perceptual gap. Cognitive scientists suggest that predictive models of social dynamics are highly sensitive to anomalies. Because social environments carry survival significance, a sudden drop in population density might signal danger, obstruction, or threat. The brain encodes these events with heightened salience, which magnifies the perception of speed and abruptness. Neurological and physiological factors can amplify the experience. Brief lapses in attention due to fatigue, stress, hypoglycemia, or microsleeps can make transitions feel instantaneous. Migraine auras or transient depersonalization episodes can distort temporal flow, creating the sensation that the world has snapped from one state to another. Even more subtle, the mind constructs a continuous narrative from discrete sensory snapshots. If the snapshots miss intermediate frames, if you glanced at a cafe and looked away for a few seconds, then refocused, the intervening departures are not recorded consciously. The result is a discontinuity in your internal map of social activity, which the conscious mind interprets as a literal vanishing act. Technology and mediated perception further complicate the picture. Video feeds, augmented reality, motion-sensitive lighting, or even smartphone screens that mediate attention can create temporal gaps, where real-time perception lags behind environmental change. Recording the event may reveal that the crowd dissipated gradually, but your memory and attention encoded as a sharp, singular transition. Similarly, reflections in glass, polished surfaces, or water can hide ongoing movement, reinforcing the sense of emptiness. Even in purely analog settings, the interplay of light, obstruction, and angle can create a perceptual funnel that makes departures seem abrupt. Memory and expectation are intimately bound to the phenomenon. You carry a mental model of how populated spaces behave based on habit, context, and social cues. When reality violates this model, when an expected density of people is absent, the effect is amplified. The brain compares expected patterns to incoming sensory input. Large prediction errors are encoded as highly salient anomalies. Once remembered, these episodes are often recounted with a sense of immediacy and impossibility. Even if closer inspection would reveal that departures were gradual or partially hidden, our recollection favors the narrative of the sudden, the dramatic, the uncanny, and this storytelling instinct reinforces the impression of instantaneous emptiness. Cultural, symbolic, and metaphysical interpretations deepen the resonance. A street emptied in a blink evokes imagery of pandemics, disasters, or supernatural phenomena. Literature, cinema, and folklore imbue deserted places with emotional weight. Quiet streets signal danger, absence, or the presence of otherworldly forces. This symbolic overlay interacts with cognitive processing, heightening attention to gaps and amplifying the emotional charge of the experience. Even when rational explanations exist, the aesthetic and narrative framing of sudden absence leaves a lasting impression, embedding the episode in memory as more dramatic than it objectively was. Philosophically, the sensation reveals how precarious our perception of social continuity truly is. Humans rely on dense networks of predictable behavior to navigate space safely and efficiently. When the network temporarily disappears, the very fabric of shared reality seems unstable. Sudden absences are a reminder that our sense of normalcy is constructed, maintained, and contingent on both internal processing and external stability. The mind assumes persistence, continuity, and density. When those assumptions are violated, even briefly, the result is a sharp, dislocating feeling akin to stepping into a ghost version of the world. Ultimately, the phenomenon sits at the intersection of attention, memory, perception, social expectation, and environmental design. It is rarely evidence of supernatural intervention, though it carries the same emotional punch as imagined impossibilities. Most episodes can be accounted for by a combination of rapid environmental changes, attentional lapses, predictive coding errors, and perceptual filtering. Yet the experience is powerful precisely because it exposes the invisible scaffolding of cognition, the assumptions, habits, and predictive models that ordinarily keep the social world coherent. When people vanish, even for a few heartbeats, the machinery that stitches together continuity falters, and the familiar suddenly becomes strange, leaving you in a space that feels simultaneously real and impossibly empty. Phantom smells. You are walking through a quiet street, a living room, or a garden, and suddenly, your senses are hijacked by a scent smoke curling from an unseen. Fire the tang of gasoline, the sweetness of roses, or the acrid sting of decay. There is no source, no lingering perfume, no smoke or chemical in the air. Yet the smell is vivid, sharp, and emotionally immediate. Phantom smells, or olfactory hallucinations, are a phenomenon where the brain conjures olfactory experiences without corresponding external stimuli, creating a powerful illusion that reality itself has been punctured by an invisible presence. The experience can be fleeting, leaving only confusion, or it can persist, persistent and uncanny, challenging the mind's assumption that the nose is always tethered to the world outside. At the core of the phenomenon is the olfactory system, which is uniquely intertwined with memory, emotion, and multi-sensory integration. Odorant molecules normally bind to receptors in the nasal epithelium, generating electrical signals transmitted through the olfactory bulb into higher brain regions, including the piriform cortex, amygdala, and hippocampus. These regions are deeply linked with emotional processing and memory formation. Unlike vision or hearing, olfactory perception is not filtered extensively through the thalamus before reaching the cortex. It arrives with direct access to areas that encode affect and episodic memory. This anatomical pathway means that olfactory hallucinations can be extremely vivid, emotionally charged, and sometimes indistinguishable from smells produced by real molecules in the air. A phantom scent can trigger nostalgia, fear, disgust, or longing, as immediately as if it were physically present. Neural misfiring is a major explanatory mechanism. Random or localized activation in the olfactory bulb or piriform. Cortex can create the perception of smell independent of any external odor. Just as an electrical disturbance in the visual cortex can produce flashes of light, and a spike in the auditory cortex can produce ringing in the ears, spontaneous olfactory firing can produce phantom odors. These misfires may be triggered by fatigue, stress, minor infections, or chemical exposure. But sometimes they occur spontaneously, without identifiable cause, because the olfactory system is tightly bound to associative memory. Even a brief misfire can conjure highly specific and emotionally salient scents, as though a door to a past experience momentarily swung open. Memory and expectation play an amplifying role. Humans are extraordinarily sensitive to odors linked to prior experiences. A whiff of a phantom scent can tap into deeply embedded memory traces. The smoke of a fireplace from childhood, the perfume of a loved one long gone, the smell of a particular food cooked decades ago. The brain is not merely passively recalling the memory. It is constructing an active sensory experience that can be indistinguishable from reality. This constructive process is adaptive in ordinary perception. It allows us to anticipate danger, locate food, and recognize individuals. But it also creates fertile ground for phantom smells when the system generates the signal internally rather than in response to external molecules. Physiological and neurological conditions influence the frequency and intensity of phantom olfaction. Upper respiratory infections, sinus inflammation, migraines, epileptic seizures, head trauma, and neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's disease can provoke hallucinations in the olfactory system. Even minor shifts in nasal airflow, humidity, or temperature can subtly alter receptor activation, producing smells that have no identifiable source. In some cases, the phenomenon is brief and benign, a momentary flicker of the system misfiring. In others, persistent olfactory hallucinations signal underlying pathology, particularly if they are accompanied by other neurological or cognitive symptoms. This physiological aspect underscores how tightly perception is linked to the integrity of neural structures and how the brain's assumptions about sensory input can be deceived. Cognitive and attentional factors further shape the experience. The brain continuously predicts the sensory environment, using context, memory, and expectation to filter and interpret incoming signals. If a familiar room, street, or object is associated with a specific odor, the brain may fill in the expected scent, even when no odorant molecules are present. This predictive coding allows us to navigate environments efficiently, but it also opens the door to misperception. When internal expectations collide with absent stimuli, the result is a phantom smell that feels remarkably real. Emotional states such as anxiety, fear, or excitement intensify the experience because the amygdala amplifies sensory signals in emotionally salient contexts. Environmental cues and associations can also trigger phantom odors. Seeing smoke, observing cooking equipment, or even reading about particular smells can activate olfactory representations in the brain. The smell does not come from the environment, but from the mind itself. This interaction between perception, attention, and associative memory blurs the boundary between reality and imagination, producing experiences that are uncanny in their immediacy and tangibility. Phantom smells are particularly disorienting because smell is often treated as a direct index of the world around us. When the nose signals fire, decay, or chemical presence, the brain assumes there is a real-world source. The mismatch between perception and physical reality creates a jarring, sometimes alarming cognitive dissonance. Culturally and psychologically, phantom smells have long been interpreted as omens, presences, or messages. Ghost stories, folklore, and religious texts frequently include inexplicable odors as evidence of spirits or unseen forces. While these interpretations are symbolic, they resonate with the experiential reality of olfactory hallucinations, which often arrive without warning and are imbued with emotional intensity. The brain's pattern-seeking instincts interpret the inexplicable smell as significant, creating layers of meaning beyond the purely sensory anomaly. From a neuroscientific perspective, phantom smells illuminate the constructive nature of perception. Sensory experience is not a passive recording, but an active synthesis of signals, memory, expectation, and context. The brain predicts what it should smell, and sometimes the prediction itself is sufficient to create the perceptual reality. This highlights the delicate balance between external stimuli and internal generation in creating what we experience as reality. In phantom olfaction, the illusion is complete. The scent exists entirely within the brain, yet it carries the full force of reality, triggering visceral, emotional, and cognitive responses as if it were a tangible presence. Ultimately, phantom smells reveal the hidden architecture of sensory experience. They are a vivid reminder that our perception of the world is mediated, constructed, and occasionally fallible. A fleeting whiff of smoke where none exists, a sudden sweetness without a rose, or an acrid chemical without any source exposes the brain's capacity to fabricate reality, to conjure the impossible with startling clarity. They lie at the intersection of physiology, memory, attention, and emotion, producing a phenomenon that is simultaneously ordinary and uncanny, a reminder that even the most basic, seemingly reliable senses can deceive, and that the mind itself is capable of generating a world that feels fully real even when it is entirely imagined. Gravity slip. You are standing on solid ground, feet planted, the world humming with the usual certainties, and then it happens. A sudden vertiginous tug, a brief sensation that your body has left the floor, or that the floor itself has dissolved beneath you. Gravity slip, as it is sometimes described, is that uncanny, almost cinematic moment when the body experiences motion floating, falling or tipping without any detectable cause. It is not a gust of wind, not a sudden collapse of the surface, not a trampoline or misstep. Your senses insist you are in freefall while your feet remain in place. The mind recoils, the stomach lurches, and the equilibrium systems scramble to reconcile perception with reality, revealing the intricate and delicate choreography that normally keeps us anchored in space. No, the phenomenon begins in the vestibular system, the inner ear apparatus that constantly monitors head position and acceleration. The semicircular canals detect angular velocity. The otolith organs detect linear acceleration and tilt relative to gravity. Normally, these inputs are integrated with visual information and proprioceptive feedback from muscles and joints to produce a stable sense of orientation. But the system is exquisitely sensitive, and even a tiny mismatch can produce the sensation of floating, tipping, or falling. A subtle shift in blood pressure, a brief change in inner ear fluid dynamics, or a microspasm in the tiny hair cells of the canals can trigger a momentary illusion of movement. The brain interprets this unexpected signal as motion through space, even when the body remains entirely stationary. Vision compounds the effect. The brain relies on visual flow to calibrate vestibular perception. Moving shadows, shifting light, or peripheral motion can exaggerate or even induce the sensation of tilting or lifting. Standing at the edge of a high platform, observing clouds or traffic far below, or even glancing across a patterned floor can create micro-conflicts between expected and sensed motion. When the visual system and the vestibular system are slightly out of sync, the result is that surreal tugging that feels like a slip in gravity. The floor tilts, the body floats, or the ground drops away, even though nothing is moved. The brain interprets the sensory discrepancy as a real event because, evolutionarily, false negatives in detecting motion or imbalance could be dangerous. The system errs on the side of caution, creating a physical sensation of movement to match a perceived threat or anomaly. Proprioception, the unconscious monitoring of muscle tension, joint angles, and weight distribution, adds another layer. Muscles and tendons continuously signal to the brain how the body interacts with gravity. Minor delays, neural noise, or asynchronous input from different limbs can amplify the illusion. A subtle microfall of one segment of the body that is quickly corrected produces a sensation of a larger, more dramatic slip. The combination of vestibular, visual, and proprioceptive noise can create a full-bodied impression of freefall, floating, or being yanked upward, even without actual displacement. This is why gravity slips can feel momentarily convincing enough to trigger panic, goosebumps, or a physiological startle response. Physiological states modulate susceptibility. Fatigue, dehydration, low blood sugar, stress, and sudden changes in body position can all increase the likelihood of these events. Hypnic jerks, the brief muscle spasms that sometimes accompany the transition into sleep, often produce a correlated sensation of falling. Similarly, microdrops in blood pressure upon standing, or transient irregularities in heart rhythm, can subtly influence vestibular and proprioceptive feedback, resulting in a floating or falling perception. Caffeine, alcohol, or certain medications can alter neural excitability, making gravity slips more likely. In this way, the phenomena is a reminder that our embodied experience is not a simple reflection of external forces, but a dynamic synthesis of internal signals, filtered through perception and cognition. Psychological factors amplify and color the experience. Anxiety heightens interoceptive awareness, the brain's monitoring of internal bodily states, so that minor discrepancies in orientation are amplified into vivid sensations. Expectation and memory also play a role. If you have felt a gravity slip before, the brain primes for it, making subsequent episodes more intense and realistic. The phenomenon intersects with the uncanny because it temporarily violates a foundational assumption that the floor is solid, that the body is predictably bound to it. When this assumption fails, even momentarily, the experience is jarring and emotionally charged, bridging the familiar and the impossible. The mind also constructs a narrative around the sensation, especially if it occurs without warning. The brief but visceral feeling of floating or falling invites metaphysical interpretations, the body leaving its bounds, glitch in reality, or an opening in space itself. Cultural and literary motifs reinforce this framing. From tales of sudden vertigo before a supernatural encounter to cinematic depictions of zero-gravity moments, the sensation, fleeting as it is, resonates deeply because it touches on primal fears and the innate human expectation of gravitational stability. Even knowing the physiological cause does little to diminish the emotional potency. The mind remembers the lurch as a real embodied event. From a neuroscientific perspective, gravity slips are a window into the delicate balancing act that maintains our sense of presence. The brain continuously integrates multiple, noisy streams of information: visual, vestibular, proprioceptive, auditory, and interoceptive, to generate the coherent impression that we are stationary in a gravitational field. Any brief misalignment, whether from internal noise, environmental cues, or rapid physiological changes, can produce an entire phenomenology of freefall. The event demonstrates that our perception of being grounded is an active construction. It's maintained moment by predictive coding and multisensory integration, rather than a passive reflection of external forces. Technology and experimental settings reinforce the principles underlying gravity slips. Virtual reality, for instance, deliberately manipulates visual and vestibular cues to create convincing illusions of motion, floating, or falling. Motion simulators, flight training rigs, and amusement park rides exploit the same sensory conflicts that generate natural gravity slips, showing how small, controlled mismatches between expectation and input produce profound bodily sensations. These controlled demonstrations mirror spontaneous occurrences, highlighting the interplay between sensory integration, prediction, and neural processing. Ultimately, gravity slips are both mundane and profound. They are mundane in that their causes are entirely natural and interplay of neural signals, physiological states, and sensory input. They are profound in that they expose the fragility and elegance of our perception of the world. For a few heartbeats, the mind experiences a universe untethered, a body momentarily freed from the certainty of the floor, revealing how much of what we take for granted, weight, solidity, verticality, is actively constructed by the brain. The fleeting sensation lingers in memory, a visceral reminder that our experience of reality is an intricate negotiation between body, brain, and environment, and that even the simplest assumptions, like the pull of gravity, can, at times, feel uncertain, astonishing, and entirely otherworldly. Looping events. You see it first as a small, almost imperceptible echo. A bird lands on the fence at precisely the same moment. You looked away, the neighbor closes their gate in the same rhythm, a car passes by and honks at the same time. At first you dismiss it, a coincidence, a trick of attention, but then it happens again and again. The sequence of events repeats in exact detail, as if the universe has pressed a subtle replay button. And the normal flow of time feels compressed, circular, and unnervingly deliberate. Looping events are unlike déjà vu, which is a fleeting impression of familiarity. These are literal repetitions that strike with the uncanny precision of a cosmic metronome. They warp the sense of continuity, challenging the mind to reconcile expectation, memory, and perception with reality as it unfolds. One way to understand looping events begins with memory and attention. The brain constantly predicts incoming sensory information based on prior experience, forming a temporal model of the immediate environment. When a series of actions occurs, neural networks encode the sequence with astonishing detail, including timing, spatial relations, and auditory cues. If attention is tightly focused and external conditions are stable, the brain can anticipate outcomes with remarkable accuracy. Occasionally, this predictive machinery produces what feels like a replay. Subtle sensory cues and pre-activated memories of the sequence make the event feel not just familiar but inevitable. The effect is amplified if your attention is fragmented or the context is emotionally charged. The mind latches onto patterns and fills in gaps, creating the impression that the environment is literally repeating. External triggers can also align with internal states to produce apparent loops. Environmental regularities, traffic lights, cycling in exact intervals, machinery operating on precise schedules. Birds following habitual paths provide predictable frameworks. If these frameworks coincide with your observation and expectations, repetition is perceived with almost mechanical fidelity. The combination of predictable external rhythms and the brain's finely tuned anticipation can create a moment where reality seems to fold back on itself. It's the same gestures, sounds, and sequences appear to recur, because both your memory and the environment operate on repeating patterns. And the intersection creates an illusion of an intentional loop rather than a natural rhythm. Temporal perception itself is malleable, and looping events exploit that flexibility. Humans measure time not with a clock, but with internal oscillators, neural rhythms, heartbeats, breathing cycles. These oscillators interact with attention, memory, and sensory input to produce subjective time. When a short interval is encoded and retrieved in rapid succession, the brain can compress or expand perception so that repetitions feel immediate and precise. In other words, two events separated by a few minutes may be neurologically treated as adjacent in subjective time, given the uncanny sense that they occurred simultaneously or as part of a continuous loop. This effect can be enhanced under fatigue, stress, or heightened emotional states. When cognitive temporal resolution falters and the mind becomes more sensitive to repeating patterns, neurological and psychiatric conditions also offer insight. Temporal lobe, microcisors, migraines with aura, and brief dissociative episodes can produce a distortion of event sequencing. The brain may momentarily replay stored sensory information alongside real-time input, producing a sensation that the same external event has occurred multiple times. Sleep deprivation or extreme monotony can amplify these effects. When the mind lacks novelty or stimulation, it becomes more prone to pattern seeking and repetition detection, which can transform ordinary occurrences into perceived loops. Even without pathology, the phenomenon underscores how fragile our sense of linear time really is, and how dependent it is on continuous, precise integration of memory, attention, and sensory input. There is also a social and narrative dimension. The human brain is inherently a story-making machine, and looping events are compelling precisely because they violate expected narrative flow. The sensation that time itself is folding back challenges the implicit assumption that life progresses in a continuous line. People naturally try to explain these experiences by constructing causal narratives, parallel universes, glitches in the fabric of reality, or subtle interventions by unseen forces. The phenomenon taps into deep cognitive appetites for coherence and pattern, which can magnify the subjective strangeness of otherwise ordinary occurrences. Even when a loop is ultimately traceable to coincidence or environmental regularity, the narrative framing in the observer's mind renders it unforgettable. Technology introduces another layer of complexity. Clocks, timers, automated lights, repeating audio alerts, and even video displays can create real, objective loops that synchronize with perception. If a system repeats a sequence at intervals that align with human observation and attention, it can reinforce the feeling that time itself has repeated. In digital media, glitches such as video or audio loops, frame skips, or refresh artifacts can mimic natural repetition, further blurring the boundary between external and internal sources of looping perception. In this way, our increasingly mediated environments make such experiences more likely, or at least more vividly noticed. From a philosophical perspective, looping events strike at the foundations of causal understanding. Humans assume temporal asymmetry. Causes precede effects, events proceed linearly. A loop, even if brief and local, produces cognitive dissonance because it violates these assumptions. The mind must either reinterpret the events as coincidental, attribute the repetition to external agents, or entertain the notion of local temporal anomalies. The stronger the precision and the emotional salience of the repetition, the harder it is to settle on a mundane explanation. This tension between expectation and observation is precisely what gives looping events their gripping, eerie quality. In practical terms, most loops can be traced to mundane sources: predictable environmental patterns, attentional focus, memory reconstruction, or brief distortions in temporal perception, careful observation, recording sequences. And cross-checking with other observers usually clarify whether the loop is a perceptual illusion or a pattern grounded in reality. Yet the experience retains its psychological potency because it exposes the mechanics of temporal cognition. It reminds us that linear time is not a simple, immutable stream, but a model built from attention, memory, and anticipation, constantly smoothed and reconstructed. When that model momentarily falters or synchronizes with external regularities, the ordinary world can feel like it is repeating itself, and for a moment, the familiar becomes profoundly uncanny. Photographic oddities. You snap a picture of a street corner, a park bench, or a quiet living room, and when you look at the image later, there is something that wasn't there before. A shadow stretching at an impossible angle. A figure in the background that your eyes didn't see. A blur that seems to hold an outline of a hand or a face. Your first reaction is disbelief, a flicker of mistrust in your own eyes. Photographic oddities occupy that strange twilight zone where reality and representation diverge. Where the world as mediated through a lens seems to defy the world as experienced firsthand, they are not simply glitches in technology. They are a mirror held up to the subtleties of perception, the quirks of light, the quirks of memory, and the strange way we encode events into tangible artifacts. At the most literal level, a photograph is a record of light striking a photosensitive surface over time. The lens gathers photons from a wide range of directions and focuses them onto a sensor or film plane, compressing three-dimensional space into a two-dimensional projection. This compression alone introduces the potential for oddities, lines that converge unnaturally, objects that appear closer or farther than they seem in real-life distortions that exaggerate perspective, reflections that duplicate shapes and superimpose layers of light from multiple sources. Long exposures amplify this effect, capturing movement that the eye perceives as a blur or misses entirely. A person walking across a scene while the shutter is open becomes a ghosted smear, a shadowed double, or an unidentifiable silhouette, and when viewed in isolation, the mind interprets it as something impossible, an anomaly in reality itself. Camera sensors in film are not passive recorders. They're instruments with limitations and idiosyncrasies. Rolling shutters, common in digital devices, capture different parts of a scene at slightly staggered times, bending straight lines into curves and stretching fast-moving objects into shapes that could never exist in space simultaneously. Lens flare and chromatic aberration warp colors and shapes at the edges of the frame, creating halos, streaks, or ghost images. Dust on the lens, fingerprints, scratches on the film, or uneven development and chemical processing add unpredictable artifacts that the brain seeks to interpret as meaningful. The human mind is exceptionally adept at pattern recognition. It's often over-interpreting random noise. A water stain becomes a face, a smudge, a hand, a shadow, a figure. The photograph, unlike direct perception, freezes a single frame of these accidents, leaving them to loom larger and stranger than they might have appeared in real time. The temporal dimension is critical. Photograph captures a fraction of a second that may include micro-events imperceptible to the human eye. A bird swoops through the scene, a leaf falls, a reflective surface catches sunlight at a specific angle. Each can create shapes and shadows that weren't consciously noticed. In addition, many oddities occur when humans move within the scene, but are too peripheral or too fast to register. You walk past your camera, out of focus, and at the edge of light, and appear in a way your brain did not encode. The resulting image seems impossible not because the event defies physics, but because perception and attention filtered it out. Memory also plays a conspiratorial role. As you recall the scene, your brain reconstructs it from sparse cues and internal templates, filling in gaps with expectation and habit. Your recollection of the empty street corner, the empty room, or the vacant park bench is a reconstruction, not a literal playback. When you later view the photograph and detect an extra figure or anomaly, the mismatch is jarring because your memory and the recorded image do not align. Your mind then searches for explanations. Shadows, reflections, double exposures, hallucinations. Each explanation is plausible but rarely immediate, giving the photograph a ghostly quality, a sense of something impossible captured in silver halide or digital bytes. The brain's predictive coding mechanisms further enhance the uncanny. We do not passively perceive, constantly predict incoming sensory input and compare it to reality. Photographs, being frozen in time, violate this predictive loop because they preserve every accident blur and reflection without the live context our brains use to interpret them. An object that appears misaligned, a figure that seems displaced, or a shadow that moves in a strange angle triggers a prediction error the brain cannot reconcile. The sensory data with the internal model it has built of the world. In that sense, photographic oddities are a glimpse of how perception normally edits experience to make it coherent. An exposure of the machinery that usually keeps reality smooth and continuous. Technology has added new layers. Smartphones, digital cameras, and social media algorithms process images in ways that can subtly warp reality. Sharpening, noise reduction, compression artifacts, and AI-based enhancements can introduce features that were not literally present. Low-light sensors exaggerate noise, producing halos or ghost shapes. HDR compositing merges multiple exposures, sometimes leaving fragments of movement superimposed. Even a slight shift between frames in automatic stitching software for panoramas can create doors, windows, or objects that were never there in reality, yet appear plausible enough to fool the mind. There is also a cultural and psychological dimension. Photographs carry an aura of truth. They're widely treated as proof of reality. When an anomaly appears, the shock is magnified because we have been trained to trust the medium. A shadow in the wrong place, a double image of a figure, or an apparent ghost triggers not only perceptual surprise, but a deeper epistemic unease. The world itself seems to be breaking its own rules. These experiences resonate with folklore and myth, with beliefs in spirits, parallel worlds, or alternate timelines precisely because the photograph offers a tangible artifact of the impossible, a concrete trace in a universe we usually only navigate with ephemeral perception. Practical investigation can often demystify the oddity. Repeating the photograph with careful attention to lighting, exposure, angle, and shutter speed often reproduces or explains the artifact. Checking the scene for reflective surfaces, bright highlights, or sources of movement can reveal natural explanations. Analyzing metadata, looking for double exposures, or comparing multiple shots of the same scene over time usually provides a rational account. Even so, the first encounter often leaves an indelible impression. The photograph becomes a testament to the fragile boundary between what we perceive directly and what the world contains beyond our immediate awareness. Ultimately, photographic oddities reveal the interplay between reality, attention, memory, and technology. They are not necessarily evidence of the supernatural, though they can feel as if they are. They're evidence of the complexity of perception and the extraordinary sensitivity of human cognition to anomalies. The photograph captures not just light, but the limitations of the mind, the quirks of physical optics, and the chaotic accidents of a dynamic world. That tension between what we remember, what we see, and what the camera preserves is what gives photographic oddities their haunting and irresistible power. They remind us that even in the most mundane frame, the universe retains the capacity to surprise. Missing streets. You take the turn you always take and the corner you always see, but today, the map in your head stutters. Where there should be a narrow lane between the bakery and the florist, there's a stretch of blank wall, or worse, a tidy courtyard was never there, or the street sign is gone, as if someone cut the label out of the city and left the paper behind. For a second, your feet forget the choreography of walking, and your mind makes a tiny, sharp noise. The world you habitually navigate has failed to match the world that presents itself. That is the felt core of a missing street episode. An everyday rupture that asks the same question a magician's trick asks: what part of my mind did I rely on? And what part betrayed me? At the heart of the phenomenon lives the cognitive map. Long before you ever learned to use smartphones, your hippocampus was quietly building a chart of place, not unlike an orienteer schematic. Landmarks as nodes, turns as vectors, shortcuts as beaten paths. Neuroscientists talk about place cells and grid cells, because an animal's specific neurons fire to mark location in geometry. We stitch those signals into a narrative map that combines allocentric knowledge, where things are in the world, with egocentric roots, how you move from A to B. That map is not a photograph, it is a compressed, relational network optimized for getting you where you want to go. When the city changes its punctuation, a row of bollards, a new pedestrian plaza seasonal market, stalls a building demolished and replaced with a blank lot. Those changes can break the small chains of cues your map uses to index a street. The place still exists physically, but no longer fits the pattern your brain uses to call it by name. In the familiar language of cognition, the map misindexes its node, and so the street briefly does not exist for you. Perception and attention are the second conspirators. Much of navigation runs on autopilot. You have done the route enough that large chunks of it are executed by habit with minimal conscious supervision. The sites that matter are the major anchors. The church spire, the red awning, the billboard for the cinema, while the side alleys' lesser signs and the exact cadence of paving stones drop into low-fidelity storage, something occludes or alters those anchors. Parked delivery trucks, scaffolding, heavy foliage, a temporary festival. Your predictive system fills in the gap with the prior template. If the template does not reconcile, you experience a mismatch so crisp that you might say the street is missing rather than simply occluded or altered. In other words, your brain didn't fail to find the street. Your map failed to recognize it under different lighting, framing, or obstruction. Change blindness and inattentional blindness. Explain how large alterations can occur without you noticing the transition. If while you were distracted by a call or an episode of intense thought, crews closed a stretch of road, the interim edits can be invisible until you return with an expectation. The moment of discovery reads like a magic trick because it compresses an entire unattended temporal interval into a single surprising snapshot. What used to be through-line A is now dead-end B. The world didn't teleport. Your attentional sampling missed the edits that would have integrated them into your narrative. Cities themselves are active storytellers. Streets are not immutable. They are argued over, repurposed, and legally reclassified. Pedestrianization projects, pop-up markets, building permits, short-term closures for film shoots, emergency responses, and renamings all recompose the urban fabric at human timescales. Planners can close a road for months while they rebuild utilities. A private developer can buy and fence off an alley. City council can rename a thoroughfare and replace its markers. For an observer reliant on yesterday's cues, the street has gone missing, not because geography shifted, but because the socio-legal scaffolding that gave the lane identity was changed. The phenomenon gains extra poignancy in gentrifying neighborhoods, where storefronts flip and facades get washed, and the mnemonic anchors people use to orient themselves are replaced with a different, smooth aesthetic. The road is physically present, but has lost the biography you attach to it. Technology does its own reshaping. A quick check of a navigation app may show a street that your eyes do not find, because maps lag behind real-world edits, or because the app follows property access rules that differ from pedestrian experience. Sometimes the reverse happens. Signage is removed or renamed quickly, and the digital map still lists the old name. When your tactile muscular memory of how to go matches neither the paper map nor the live scene, your brain produces a sharp epistemic ache. The where is it that feels like a street vanishing. Augmented reality, private roads visible only to subscribers, gated developments, and even out-of-date aerial imagery train us to trust representations that can be wrong in small but decisive ways. Memory itself plays a subtler trick. The city you remember is an edited reconstruction built from salient episodes. The one time you watched a parade there, the joyous evening you met a friend under a neon sign, not a continuous recording. These episodes serve as the skeleton of your root memory. When those events are taken away by renovation or by the simple erosion of a shopfront, the memory loses key nodes. Reconsolidation makes matters worse. Each recall slightly rewrites the memory. If you tell the story of where you lived in a different decade and do it often, your retelling can fossilize a past street layout so strongly that when you return and find the route altered, your mind treats the present as the aberration. Friends who never knew the old block are baffled. Your certainty grows because the memory trace has been repeatedly strengthened, even though its referent has shifted. Neurological and psychiatric factors sometimes amplify the effect. People with developmental topographical disorientation experience difficulty forming cognitive maps and may report streets that aren't there because their internal mapping fails to line up with the external world. Focal lesions in the right hippocampus or parietal regions, certain kinds of migraine aura, transient ischemic events, or dissociative states can distort spatial memory and scene recognition. Under fatigue, intoxication, or acute stress, the brain's integrative machinery can loosen. The result is often a feeling of derealization in which familiar places flicker between the known and the uncanny. If episodes happen repeatedly or are accompanied by other perceptual anomalies, professional evaluation is sensible. The missing street could be the symptom of a change in the map-making hardware, not just a civic renovation. There is a social psychology too. Collective memory is malleable, and neighborhood lore can patch over real change with shared stories. Two long-term residents may argue about whether a lane ever had cobbles or a pale blue shopfront. Each might genuinely remember different versions because they attended two different events. Such disagreements can fossilize into narratives about the city that used to be versus the current one, and those narratives feed back into individual perception. If enough people swear a little street was once there, the idea becomes a cultural object even if the empirical record is ambiguous. Human beings are excellent at making communal myths that stitch over discontinuities. On the fringe of explanation lie the metaphors we prefer for things that feel too strange for mere bureaucracy. Simulation rollbacks, parallel timelines, or cosmic pruning belong there. They are beautiful, and they resonate with the phenomenology because they make the sense of it seem literal. You can imagine the city as software and the missing street as a deleted object that briefly persists in cache. Those models are not necessary to account for the experience, but they speak to the hunger in our storytelling minds to put the uncanny into a grander, more mysterious frame. Practically, you can treat a missing street moment as a diagnostic clue. If the street reappears after an hour, check for events, construction, or temporary closures. If multiple passersby confirm the closure, the cause is public and mundane. If your GPS shows a street but your eyes do not, consult municipal notices or older imagery. If maps disagree, the difference is often bureaucratic lag. If the sensation is internal, repeated only for you, linked to fatigue or stress, try simple interventions. Rest, hydration, a pause to reorient, or a test with a camera or a friend. If episodes proliferate, especially with disorientation in other contexts, consider medical evaluation. The distinction matters because the salient intuitions we have about permanence are not guarantees. They are constructions that can be bent by the city, by attention, or by brain state. Finally, there is a quiet lesson embedded in the uncanny. Streets are not inert things. They are archives of use. A missing street is an index of change, of commerce, of policy, of fashion, of social life. When a lane disappears from your internal map, it is often because its function, facade, or signage has been repurposed. The small shock that follows is not only a cognitive hiccup, It is a reminder that the built world and the inner map you carry are in constant negotiation. Paying attention to that negotiation makes you a better walker of the city. It teaches you to look not only at where you put your feet, but at the transient scaffolding of identity that cities use to tell you where you are. Objects disappearing. You set a mug down on the kitchen table, step away for a breath, and when you turn back, it is not there. For a beat, you think you must have placed it somewhere else, then you swear you left it exactly where you did, and then 10 minutes later, it is back on the same spot as if the world rehearsed a tiny edit and then rewound. That feeling, an object in plain sight briefly vanishing only to reappear unchanged, presses on a dozen seams at once. The limits of vision, the tricks of attention, the slipperiness of memory, the stubborn facts of the physical environment, and the stories we tell when things don't behave. Unpacking the phenomenon means following each thread until you see how ordinary mechanisms can knit the impossible into something explainable, which is what makes the whole thing so deliciously uncanny. Start with vision and attention. Seeing is not the passive reception of light. It is active sampling directed by where you aim your gaze and what your brain judges important. If you glance at the table and then look away to answer a phone, your eyes make rapid jumps called saccades, during which perception is suppressed. Saccadic suppression prevents the blur caused by eye motion from flooding consciousness. Between saccades, your brain stitches together a coherent picture using the higher resolution center of gaze and much lower resolution peripheral information. Many everyday objects survive in memory only because you encoded them when they were faux-vivid. If you didn't take a decisive look, the next time you sweep your eyes, you may not re-encode them, creating a momentary absence. Inattentional blindness, famously illustrated by the gorilla experiment, shows that when attention is elsewhere, even highly salient items can be missed entirely. Change blindness demonstrates that even large, obvious alterations to a scene go unnoticed if they occur during a disruption of view. So the simplest explanation is not magic, but a predictable failure of sampling. The object never left the world. Your brain simply didn't update its internal map of it. Perception's partner, memory, has its own mischief. When you retrieve an event putting the mug down, you reconstruct it from sparse notes rather than replaying a videotape. Reconsolidation makes those notes malleable. Each recollection is also an opportunity to edit. If you later imagine the mug in your hands or rehearse a reason you needed to move it, that imagined sequence can lodge as an alternative memory. Confidence in a memory is not a thermometer for accuracy. It measures how integrated a trace is. People can be exquisitely certain about details that never occurred, because repeated retrieval and telling solidify a constructed narrative. So you may feel exactly certain that you left the mug where you did, even though, in the moment of distraction, someone nudged it or a cat pushed it aside. The object's vanishing becomes a mismatch between your reconstructed past and the present record. Physical and environmental factors are often the pragmatic villains. Transparent or highly reflective objects, clear plastic containers, glassware, a pane of mirrored glass. Behind a stack of papers or a polished countertop can hide items in plain sight. Reflections, glare, and background patterns can camouflage an object so effectively that it seems to vanish when lighting changes slightly. A mug with a light interior on a bright, shiny table can seem to merge with reflections and disappear from a quick glance. A gust of wind, a sudden sunlight shift through leaves, or a passing car's headlights can momentarily erase the contrast that made the object pop. Even temperature gradients causing mirage-like shimmering or a thin film of condensation can break the visual continuity. In many impossible disappearance stories, the object never moved more than a centimeter. It simply slipped into a visual equilibrium where your perceptual system no longer treats it as a distinct entity. Human actors and tricks of the social world are prosaic explanations that nonetheless feel theatrical. Children, pets, and other people move things and then replace them. A prank or an absent-minded habit can explain apparently supernatural returns. Sleight of hand and deliberate misdirection are well known. Magicians exploit the exact attentional bottlenecks that cause objects to be missed. If the object's disappearance is intermittent and accompanied by others being present, the forensic route tasking witnesses, checking surveillance, or setting a small marker usually resolves whether it was moved. The social dimension also shapes memory. Once someone suggests you moved the mug, your memory will readily accommodate that claim, creating a shared but inaccurate narrative. Neurology supplies rarer, but biologically real roots. brief focal seizures in the temporal lobe, transient global amnesia, brief dissociative episodes, microsleeps. Certain kinds of migraine can produce episodes of confusion, paired encoding, or altered awareness that make it feel like objects vanished. These events are not common in healthy people, but they do occur, and when they do, the world can behave in ways that feel discontinuous. Medication, side effects, hypoglycemia, severe sleep deprivation, and intoxication can have similar temporary effects on attention and memory. If episodes happen frequently, become longer, or are accompanied by other cognitive changes, they warrant medical attention because they may be telling you something about brain state, not about ghosts. There is a technological layer now that few older explanations had to consider. Augmented reality displays heads-up overlays, where the ever-present glow of a phone can change how we sample and trust the visual scene. People habituated to seeing digital overlays that annotate and pop in and out may find their trust in raw sensory input eroded. A virtual object that was visible and then turned off can prime you to expect similar real-world flickers. Home automation and robotic assistants sometimes move things and return them on a schedule. Security cameras and mirrored surfaces can create illusions of absence. Recorded footage compressed at low frame rates might miss a short movement, giving the human viewer the impression of an impossible return. If you want to test what's going on, the phenomenon suggests straightforward experiments, because the competing models predict different signatures. If the disappearance is optical, a camera with continuous high-resolution recording will capture the object's presence, even if your eyes missed it. If it is a social prank, video and witness checks will reveal hands in the frame. If it is your brain's failure, the camera will show the object steady. While your subjective report shifts, a small, distinctive mark on the object, a few grains of salt on one edge, a tiny sticker turns the problem into a traceable feature. If it remains visible on the footage when your awareness failed, the explanation leans perceptual. Repeating the condition's lighting angle, attention load can reveal whether the effect is reproducible and thus likely environmental or transient state dependent. When episodes correlate with fatigue, stress, or certain substances, physiology is implicated. If they escalate or are accompanied by blackouts or confusion, it's responsible to seek medical evaluation. Beyond the mechanistic parade, there are cultural and metaphysical readings because the experience invites story. People love the idea that reality hiccups occasionally, that there are snags in the cloth of the world through which things can slip. Simulation metaphors, checkpoint rollbacks, memory caches that survive a rewrite fit the phenomenology elegantly. Your copy of reality retained a fragment that the system later overwrote. Parallel world narratives let you imagine an object oscillating between nearly identical branches, visible in one and not in another. Those accounts are aesthetically satisfying and speak to a human appetite for drama. They are not, however, necessary to explain how ordinary brain and physics can produce the same sensations. Importantly, each account makes different behavioral and epistemic claims. If the world is actually changing, independent, verifiable evidence will accumulate. Multiple observers, continuous recordings, or physical traces that do not depend on a single mind's report. If the explanation is internal to perception or memory, the effect will be observer-dependent, sensitive to cognitive load, and reducible by attention-restoring interventions, sleep, food, grounding exercises. If the cause is environmental, altering light or angle will change the result reproducibly. Knowing what to expect lets you design low-effort checks. Record the scene with a phone. Mark the object. Ask a neutral witness to watch for a few minutes, and pay attention to your own physiological state. The phenomenon carries a quieter lesson about the human condition. Objects disappearing and reappearing in place are not merely curiosities. They are demonstrations that our experience of a stable world is an achievement, not an entitlement. For most of the waking day, your brain is running a costly program of selection, suppression, and prediction to keep the clutter of sensation from overwhelming action. When that program misaligns with the environment because of a glare, a saccade, a distracting thought, you get the small, apt feeling that the universe is less steady than you assumed. That feeling is unnerving, but it's also informative. It shows which features your cognition uses as anchors for reality. and it reminds you that perception, memory, and the physical world are entangled in ways that make ordinary life both efficient and intriguingly fallible. So if you find your keys vanish and reappear, there is almost certainly a mundane explanation somewhere along the chain. The object, light, or people moved. Your gaze skipped, your memory edited. A camera would have the truth. But whether explained by physics, physiology, or prank, the event leaves the same trace. A small rift in certainty that invites curiosity. The right response is practical inspection, and when needed, a check on sleep and stress. If the episodes persist or widen, then the rift warrants a professional look. Otherwise, enjoy the tiny reminder that reality is a practice, one that sometimes lets you catch it in the act of being made. Mismatched shadows. You notice it in a sliver of afternoon light. A child runs past, and the dark shape on the pavement lags or leads as if it has its own will. A lamp on a table throws a black silhouette that does not line up with the vase that casts it. A person's shadow seems longer on one side of their body than the other. That small wrongness, the shadow that refuses to be an obedient twin of its object, is deliciously unsettling because shadows are supposed to be the most honest proof that an object occupies space and time. When a shadow betrays its source, the world feels as if someone left a loose stitch in the weave of things. At the simplest level, the explanation is geometry and physics. Shadows are not single things, but patterns produced by the interaction of light, surface, and object. A point source of light produces sharp, crisply defined umbrae. Extended sources produce penumbrae, gradients of partial occlusion that soften and smear edges. Multiple light sources, each with its own angle and spectrum, pile shadows on top of each other. The brain prefers a neat single-cast silhouette, so two overlapping shadows can look like one odd misaligned shadow when their edges blur. Interreflections, light bouncing off colored walls or shiny floors, add subtle fill that changes apparent direction and intensity. Materials themselves conspire. Translucent objects let light scatter through them, so the shadow is tinged or displaced. Glossy surfaces create highlights and ghost shadows from secondary reflections. Throw in atmospheric effects, fog, dust, heat, shimmer, and a shadow's outline becomes a living thing, stretched and broken by turbulence. In short, the physics alone can produce mismatches that look uncanny, because our ordinary model of a shadow is a simplified caricature of what light actually does. Perception magnifies those physical quirks into narratives. The visual system is wired to bind motion and form, to assign parts of a scene to objects, and to expect that a shadow belongs to the nearest occluding shape that moves with the same pattern. That binding depends on tight temporal correlation. If an object moves, and a dark patch on the ground moves synchronously, the mind links them. Break the timing by even fractions of a second, because of retinal persistence, neural processing delays, or the different latencies of separate photoreceptor channels, and the association strains. Peripheral vision, with low spatial resolution but high sensitivity to motion, often does the first pass of assigning shadows. It treats coarse silhouettes as enough. Later, when you bring the scene into foveal inspection, mismatch becomes a paradox. Your fast, lazy priors have already made a commitment, and your slow scrutiny cannot unmake the felt identity without effort. This is why shadow errors that happen at a glance feel more real than ones you study. The brain's quick. Heuristic has already painted the story. The brain's predictive machinery is another lever. Expectation about lighting, for example, the assumption that the sun is the dominant source functions as a powerful prior. When reality violates that prior, because an artificial light or a reflected beam is stronger in a local patch, your prediction error must be resolved. The usual resolution is to rewrite the scene to fit the sensory input. Either the shadow belongs to someone else, or the light source is moved, or the shadow is a trick of the surface. But when none of those edits satisfies the network, you get the felt mismatch, an unresolved prediction error that tastes like a glitch. People who spend a lot of time in environments with complex lighting, theaters, clubs, restaurants with layered fixtures, experience more such moments because their priors are being challenged more often. There is also a binding problem specific to shadows. What is the shadow attached to? The visual system uses a handful of heuristics: proximity, common fate, relative size, continuity of occlusion, To answer that question, break any of those heuristics and mismatches arise. A shadow projected across a ridge or a curb will undergo parallax and may appear displaced from its object when viewed from a certain angle. An object partially occluding another will cast a shadow that seems to belong to the occluded thing when seen from the wrong vantage. When two objects are nearby and one shadow crosses the other, the brain can swap ownership of pieces of dark patches, producing the uncanny sense that the wrong person is casting the shadow. Neurology supplies further currency for the phenomenon. The networks that mark self and agency, that integrate proprioceptive signals with visual feedback, are finely tuned to keep body, movement, and their environmental consequences coherent. Small perturbations to those networks, sleep deprivation, tense stress, migraine aura, brief ischemic episodes, or even certain medications can reduce the fidelity of timing or the strength of cross-modal binding. Under those conditions, a shadow may feel detached in the same way a limb feels foreign during brief depersonalization. The experience is not necessarily pathological. It simply reflects the fact that the machinery which normally enforces a tight shadow-to-object coupling is fallible and state-dependent. Technology has introduced new flavors of mismatch. Video displays introduce frame latency and rolling shutter distortions. Augmented reality systems sometimes render shadows incorrectly or not at all. Projectors can cast artificial shadows that compete with natural ones. In a world where many shadows are computationally generated or filtered through glass and pixels, our priors get retrained. When the real shadow refuses to conform to an edited or delayed image you've been watching, the discrepancy feels like a lie. Even ordinary cameras can mislead. Long exposures smear moving objects and their shadows differently. A strobe can freeze an object while a flickering light splits a shadow into multiple discrete silhouettes. Photographic artifacts and the physiological timing of vision can therefore conspire to create memories of mismatched shadows that persist once encoded. There is an ecological social side too. Shadows carry information about time of day, materiality, and proximity. They are cues used by predators and prey and thus carry salience. Our cultural scripts give shadows symbolic weight, omens, doubles, silhouettes of guilt, and when a shadow misbehaves, we are primed to read it teleologically. Once you have a narrative frame like something is off, attention will harvest more anomalies that fit it. A single mismatch can seed a story about haunted houses or parallel worlds because the human mind is a skilled storyteller that will recruit anomalous sensory events into metaphors that matter to identity and fear. How would one separate the plausible causes? The physics predicts pattern. Mismatches tied to surface deformation, multiple sources, or scattering will have measurable geometric signatures. They will persist across observers and can be photographed. Perceptual accounts predict dependence on viewing angle, distance, and the observer's state. Fix the gaze. Change vantage or assure rest, and the mismatch may vanish. Technological causes predict repeatability with electronic equipment and dependence on refresh rates or projector alignment. Neurological accounts predict that the same individual will report more mismatches when sleep-deprived or stressed, and that the mismatches will fade with recovery. These differences matter because they tell you whether the world or your model of it is doing the surprising thing. Metaphysically, it is tempting to dramatize a mismatched shadow as evidence of an alternate sheet of reality brushing past ours, a sign that something about the ontology of being is porous. That's a compelling story. And sometimes the need for a good tale is what keeps the memory vivid. But you can also appreciate how rich the mundane explanation is. A simple cast of light, glossy floor, a second lamp, a tired brain, a camera sensor, a crowd of similar clothing. Each of those is an actor in the small theater that produces the uncanny. The mismatch is a diagnostic press, revealing which cues you trust and how the mind stitches them into a coherent world. Ultimately, the uncanny power of mismatched shadows comes from what they reveal. Shadows are cheap, easily produced phenomena that nonetheless carry disproportionate epistemic weight. When they behave badly, they force a recalibration. They show you where your assumptions about light and object meet the raw stubbornness of physical reality and the noisy machinery of perception. The momentary flip from that is the shadow of that person to this shadow is wrong. It's an invitation to look closer, not just at the pavement and the angle of the lamp, but at how your brain keeps the world tidy. Shadows betray the seams, and when they do, you can see for a second the plumbing that makes a stable, sensible scene out of scattered photons. Wrong reflections. You stand in front of a mirror, and, for a second, the thing that looks back is not exactly yours. Maybe the mouth twitches a fraction late. Maybe the hairline is a shade different. Maybe the reflected room contains a lamp that never existed. The moment is small, almost embarrassing to describe, because the mirror is supposed to be the most literal. The one place where appearance and reality agree. When it doesn't, it feels like the fabric of ordinary truth has been eased loose at a corner, and you can glimpse the stitches. That sting of unease is what wrong reflections are about, and the phenomenon can be read at many levels at once. Physical optics, engineered surfaces, perceptual machinery, memory and expectation, transient brain states, and the stories we tell ourselves about what a mirror is for. At the most prosaic layer, the mirror is simply an optical device, and not an infallible one. Real mirrors have thickness, multiple surfaces, slightly wavy glass, old silvering coatings that desaturate or tint. And when you place two panes close together, you can create ghost images from secondary reflections. A window with a bright room behind you looks like a mirror at night. A two-way mirror will hide changes in brightness and give you a reflection that seems one step removed from the scene. Water and polished metal behave differently from a plane of glass refraction. Ripples and surface tension bend geometry in ways that make shapes swim, compress, or stretch. Hot air makes shimmering distortions. Those physical facts alone can produce reflections that are odd in timing, color, or proportion in which the brain interprets as wrong, because they violate the expectation of literal sameness. But most of the uncanny reports, a reflection that smiles a beat later, a reflection that looks younger, reflection that doesn't quite mimic your expression, are not about glass. They are about prediction. Your visual system is a prediction machine, does not passively register light. It models what your face will look like in the next instant and constantly checks that prediction against incoming sensory data. A mirror usually produces near zero prediction error. What you expect to see matches what you see. When the match breaks, you notice. The break can come from the world's shadow, distortions in the mirror, or from the brain fatigue, medication, stress. But the felt quality is the same. The model that normally tracks you has slipped, and a tiny error signal has become a story. Memory and familiarity tangle with prediction to deepen the illusion. You have spent years learning the mirror version of yourself. That is the face you know best because you see your mirrored face every morning when you brush your teeth. It becomes the canonical image in your mind. Photographs of yourself, however, show you the non-mirrored view, the version other people see. And that difference is why your selfie can look off. When brief discrepancies occur between the habitual mirror image model and the live data, your brain sometimes privileges the richer, more rehearsed template and interprets the live data as slightly wrong. In other cases, your recall will feed the perception. You will fill in a detail in the reflection from a stored image because that detail belongs in the template. The reflection then appears altered because memory is coloring perception. Neural dynamics provide a further and stranger set of levers. The systems that mark familiarity, agency, and body ownership, parts of the temporal lobe, parietal cortex. And insula can be transiently biased by sleep deprivation, migraine aura, certain medications, or moments of dissociation. When those biases occur, the coupling between I move and I see myself move weakens. The result is derealization or depersonalization. Your face may look like a mask, or your reflected movements may seem delayed or mechanical. The phenomenon is not necessarily pathological. It is the same circuitry that allows us to distinguish self from other and to build a continuous sense of bodily agency. When that machinery hiccups, even slightly, the mirror becomes evidence that the machinery is doing something unusual. There are also social and cultural mechanics to consider. Mirrors are not neutral objects in our lives. They are scaffolds for identity work. The face you catch in a shop mirror, the rear view glance in a car window, the profile in a glossy photograph are all cues you've learned to read for social signals. Expectation bias is what you will notice. If you are anxious about your hair, you will be primed to see anomalies there. If you are rehearsing a lie or trying a new expression, you might retroactively perceive your reflection as stiffer or looser than it actually was. Shared myths amplify the strangeness. Stories about mirrors lying, alternate worlds behind glass, or other selves prime people to interpret ordinary optical quirks as metaphysical wrongness. Technology has complicated the matter. Cameras and displays introduce lag and compression. A webcam can show your movements a few dozen milliseconds behind reality. When you stand before a screen and then glance at a real mirror, the mismatch between live motion and buffered video can feel like an error in the mirror itself. Augmented reality and portrait filters habituate us to seeing faces that are computationally smoothed, brightened, or reshaped. When a real mirror refuses such edits, the honest reflection can feel wrong because it violates a newer, edited prior. In short, our perceptual priors are being trained by artificial surfaces as much as by glass. How would you tell what's happening? There are simple, informal probes that separate causes. If the reflection appears geometrically distorted, check the surface. Warped glass, multiple panes, or ripples in metal will produce systematic distortions you can photograph. If the discrepancy is temporal, a lag or anticipatory smile, compare yourself to a high-speed camera, or film the mirror and watch the playback. If the mirror lags, the camera will confirm it only if the delay is optical or due to a screen. Otherwise, it will show that perception, not the mirror, is the culprit. If the oddness is tied to your internal state and softens after sleep, food, or a walk, you have evidence that physiology modulated the effect. If friends and strangers report the same anomaly, you have a social or environmental source to investigate. Perhaps the store installed a two-way pane, or a distant projector is creating ghost highlights. Philosophically, all these layers are interesting because a mirror is where we go to check the world against our model of ourselves. A mirror that lies speaks directly to the gap between representation and reality. Whether the cause is glass, the geometry of light, a tired brain, or a culture of edited faces, the experience is an invitation to examine how tightly you trust your own models. The wrong reflection is both a sensory oddity and a phenomenological hint. Continuity and identity are actively maintained feats. The mirror, that most literal of objects, is useful precisely because it usually aligns with our internal prediction. When it doesn't, the misalignment is loud. It makes visible the invisible computations that make you feel like you are you. Ultimately, wrong reflections are not proof of alternate worlds, so much as demonstrations of how fragile and fabulously intricate the machinery of perception is. They expose the seams where light, glass, expectation, memory, and neural circuitry meet. They can be solved on the bench with optics and cameras soothed by sleep and grounding, cloaked in myth and left as haunting little reminders that what looks like the most straightforward surface is also one of the most complicated interfaces you possess. Duplicated people. You're walking down a street, and for a moment the world doubles. Two people stand side by side who could be clipped from the same photograph, same jawline, same tilt of head, same muffled laugh. For an instant, the brain refuses the coincidence. It tastes like a small cosmic error, the world copying and pasting a person it already used. That sting of uncanny similarity is what the duplicated people phenomenon feels like. And unpacking it reveals how many different systems, perceptual, cognitive, social, technological, and cultural, conspire to make such an improbable seeming thing feel perfectly possible. Start with how we see faces. Human face perception is a specialized skill. The visual system doesn't treat a face like any other object, runs fast, holistic algorithms tuned to configural relationships. The distance between eyes, the slope of a cheekbone, the curve where hair meets forehead. Neuroscientists talk about a high-dimensional face space. Each person's face is a point in this space, defined by dozens or hundreds of axes. When two faces sit near each other in that space, they look eerily similar. And under certain viewing conditions, low light, brief glance, partial occlusion, those small distances collapse. Peripheral vision and fast saccades strip away fine detail, leaving the brain to rely on coarse averaged features. The result is a quick sweep hoverbrush identity that can make distinct people read as near identical. Prediction and expectation deepen the effect. Your brain is always guessing what it will see next, and it collapses ambiguity toward the most likely interpretation. If you're in a neighborhood where a few looks dominate, similar hairstyles, a local uniform, the same brand of jacket, the prior probability that a passerby will match a recent face rises. The visual system prefers continuity. It will classify new input as same when the input is noisy, but the hypothesis of sameness is cheap and explanatory. In other words, perception is biased towards sameness wherever the cost of error is low and the payoff of recognition is high. Memory plays a mischievous role. We do not remember faces as pixel-perfect records. We store gist and salient features. Faces we've seen recently leave stronger traces and pull new, similar faces into their orbit during recognition. Source confusion is common. An angle you saw in a photo yesterday can be grafted onto a live stranger today. There's also a binding problem. Attributes, voice, gait. Clothes are encoded in partially independent channels and can be recombined during retrieval. You may correctly recall a jacket and a jawline, but they may belong to different people in the archive. When those pieces align in the present, your brain reads that alignment as identity. Social and cultural factors are deceptively powerful. Fashion cycles and retail distribution create populations that look alarmingly similar. If 10,000 people buy the same haircut, small facial template similarities become amplified by hairstyle, posture, accessories. Social media and celebrity influence harden certain aesthetics into local templates. Algorithms promote lookalike images to trend followers. Photographs and influencers propagate a narrow band of facial presentation that crowds then mirror. So what seems like a metaphysical copy often has a very prosaic origin. Convergent aesthetic choices in a shared environment. Statistics also matter. The world is large, and large numbers produce unlikely coincidences all the time. In a busy city, the combinatoric space of faces is sampled intensely. The probability that two strangers will fall into the same small neighborhood of face space is small, but non-zero. And if you live long enough and walk through enough crowds, you will meet that small probability. Our psychology, tuned to notice pattern and agency, elevates these collisions into stories. Spotting a twin on a train feels momentous, because our minds are wired to be surprised by low probability events that look like pattern repetition. There are pathological and near-pathological cases that show how the system can fail. Clinical misidentification syndromes like capgras illustrate the mind's fragile bookkeeping. A loved one can be experienced as an imposter, or conversely, wildly different people can be felt as the same, because the brain's familiarity and identity signals get uncoupled. Transient neurological states, migraine, fatigue, certain temporal lobe irritations, can temporarily bias familiarity signals and increase false matches. Those are extremes, not the norm, but they map the same anatomical circuitry that underwrites everyday duplications. Technology adds a new twist. The ubiquity of portrait filters, face-tuned lighting, and AI-generated faces creates a kind of homogenization. When an entire culture is fed a steady stream of near-identical facial types, those templates can infiltrate your internal face space and increase false positives. Worse, the same editing tools applied across many users produce a chorus of people who look like variations on the same base. Add to that the rise of deepfakes and face swapping. Digital doubles teach the visual system to accept certain morphological patterns as normal, further flattening perceived variance. There's also a social cognitive loop. When you call attention to a duplication, you prime others to look for the same pattern. Group conversation can lock two observers into a shared misrecognition, because once one person labels two people as the same, the other brings this frame to the scene and begins sampling for confirming features. Memory reconsolidation then tightens the shared story. Private oddity can rapidly become a social consensus, and from there bloom into folklore or urban legend. If you want the scenic metaphors, thinkers who toy with metaphysical interpretations will happily orbit this phenomenon. You can imagine branches of reality that produce near-identical agents, or a simulation that reuses efficient character models and occasionally instantiates lookalikes where the human perceptual system is most sensitive. Those frames are poetic more than empirical, and they do something valuable. They show how readily our minds will graft story onto anomaly. The metaphysical option satisfies the narrative hunger our pattern detectors have when faced with uncanny repetition. What predictions does a rigorous account make, and how could you check them? Perceptual account says duplication should be most vivid under poor viewing conditions, high cognitive load, or strong prior expectations. So check whether the twin feel fades under close inspection in good light. The social template account predicts that local style convergence increases duplication reports. So ask whether you see more twins near fashion hubs or during seasons when certain looks are trendy. The memory account predicts that recent exposure to a face photo ad, friend's story, raises false match rates. If you've recently seen a face on your screen, you're more likely to feel you've seen it again in person. At core, the duplicated people's sensation is a collision between an incredibly efficient cognitive economy and a world that sometimes produces fortuitous redundancy. The brain favors templates, generalizations, and guesses because they make life tractable. That same thrift occasionally yields the illusion that reality has copied itself. The moment is uncanny because it points at the mechanism. Identity is constructed, not simply registered. When two strangers look identical in the same place, you are seeing the seams of your own recognition system. Whether the source is biological, social, statistical, or technological, the experience is the same kind of mirror. It shows you how your mind builds the people it recognizes, and how fragile that construction can be when the world lines up just so. The wrong memory. The wrong memory begins as a confident, it's almost tactile certainty. You can feel the grain of the table that never existed. Hear the turn in a sentence no one else remembers. Picture a logo with a flourish that the world insists was never printed. It isn't like forgetting where you put your keys. It's the opposite. It is remembering too well, remembering something crisp and self-consistent that collides head-on with the records, with your friends, with the collective story. You don't feel diluted. You feel precise. That's the unsettling part. The detail is so clear you could sketch it, and yet every confirming surface gives back a different reflection. One way to understand this is to accept that memory is not a recording device, but a storyteller with a tight budget. The brain doesn't save raw footage. It saves compressed scene descriptions, the gist, the causal links, the emotional weight, the landmarks that make a narrative navigable. When you retrieve a memory, you aren't pressing play. You're rebuilding the scene from those sparse instructions. Reconstruction means interpolation. Your mind fills gaps with the most plausible pieces from its warehouse of patterns. What kitchens generally look like, how your friend usually laughs, which tagline belongs beneath that brand. Usually this pattern completion is a marvel. It gives you continuity, where raw data would give you static. But the same power can run a little too clean and produce a version so coherent it feels truer than the messy original. That is the wrong memory. A reconstruction that wins not because it matches the past, but because it explains the present too elegantly. Prediction stands behind this sleight of hand. Perception itself is a guess refined by incoming evidence, and memory is a guess refined by what you need the past to have been, so that the present makes sense. Think of your mind as a version control system that wants smooth commit history. You go to recall a night out. The friend you drifted away from is now central to the story, because the drift matters in your current life. The offhand comment that stung has more gravity. The weather brightens because you're telling it to someone who hates rain. These tweaks are not lies, they're model updates. Later, when a photograph contradicts you, your memory doesn't feel wrong. The photo feels narrow. The memory is a theory that accounted for more. All of this runs through ordinary mechanics with fancy names. Source monitoring is the brain's attempt to tag where a detail came from. Was that image seen, imagined, or described? The tags are minimal metadata, and they're prone to being swapped. A friend's story may be refiled as your vantage point. A vivid dream can be refiled as waking experience, because it shares the same sensory geometry in your head. Reconsolidation is the process by which retrieving a memory makes it malleable for a short window. Anything you think, say, or learn during that window can get braided into the trace. Sleep then bakes the braid. On the far side, the memory is both stronger and, in small ways, different. Confidence tracks strength. not accuracy. When you feel sure, you're measuring how well the trace is wired into your network, not how well it corresponds to the world. Schemas and scripts do the heavy lifting. A schema is a compact model of how a thing should be. A school hallway, a job interview, a family dinner. Scripts are the typical sequences that run inside those settings. They guide attention, decide what to store, and fill in what you didn't notice. If the restaurant had napkins in a dispenser, your schema may later supply cloth napkins folded on plates, because that's what nice dinner looks like in your internal catalog. If a brand redesigned last year, your schema may drag the old logo forward, because the old one is the stable template. You aren't misremembering at random. You are applying the right template at the wrong time. The social world complicates everything. Memories are not private property, they are negotiated documents. You tell a story to a friend, the friend nods or corrects, you absorb their reaction, and the merged version replaces the lone one. Over time, groups grow a consensus memory with clean edges and useful morals. When your detail refuses to join, it isn't just about a fact, it's about belonging to a shared timeline. The culture gives you names for this dissonance: Mandela effect, parallel timelines, glitches, because the feeling itself demands a category. Those names are not proofs, but they are powerful. Once a frame exists, your attention recruits more near misses, and the private aberration gathers a public pattern. The effect deepens. 2 or 3 people reporting the same wrong memory is not a laboratory result. But to the narrative mind, it feels like independent confirmation from a neighboring universe. Emotion is the highlighter. A slight that mattered, a joy that felt unearned, a decision you need to justify. These attract edits the way magnets attract filings. The past is most remodelable, where it plugs into identity. If a particular version of the event preserves your sense of who you are, will be preferentially retrieved and preferentially strengthened. Over many retellings, the alternate version earns fluency. Fluency, in turn, is mistaken for truth, because true things are easy to think. This is why I can see it so clearly as not evidence. Clarity is often a symptom of a well-practiced reconstruction, not a camera-like record. The wrong memory also exploits the grain of time and consciousness. We don't experience continuous flow, we stitch frames. Moments you never encoded cannot be recovered. The reconstructive engine must bridge them. The bridge is built with materials from similar moments in another classroom, another party, another intersection at dusk. The seam disappears to you, even if it cannot survive external audit. Under stress or fatigue, sampling gets coarser, gaps get larger, bridges get longer, and the final roadway feels smooth. Later, someone points to the join, and you swear there isn't one, because your drive across it was seamless. There are neurological quirks that push in the same direction without making anyone pathological. Temporal lobe systems signal familiarity. Prefrontal regions adjudicate source and sequence. Small, transient bias too much familiarity. Too little source control can make an imagined scene feel owned by the past. Migraine aura, low sleep, anesthesia, recovery, strong emotion, even caffeine can tilt this balance for an hour. In that window, details you're rehearsing can slip backward into the archive and anchor there. The archive will defend them with the same fervor it uses to defend real events, because the archive is built to defend coherence, not correspondence. If you want the poetic version, there are metaphysical frames ready to receive the wrong memory without calling it wrong. Main Worlds enthusiasts propose that your recollection belongs to a neighbor branch, where the cereal box did have the serif. The song lyric used the other word. The friend took the flight that was canceled here. The simulation story imagines rollbacks and patches. You lived the morning once, the system corrected a bug, and you lived a slightly different morning, but your cache kept a few lines from the first run. Block universe thinkers suggest that your mind is sensitive to structural similarities across the timeline, and occasionally misindexes an isomorphic patch as identical rather than merely analogous. These stories aren't necessary to explain the phenomenon. Cognitive science can carry the weight, but they rhyme with the phenomenology. They give names to the strange conviction that your private chronology is true in a way public chronology can't access. Notice the equilibrium the theory predicts. The wrong memory is rarely chaotic. It's tidy. It differs at the edge, as spelling, color, phrasing, positions of small objects, because those are the places where schemas apply strongest, and verification is rarest. It resists disproof because the memory supplies its own context, and the context is self-consistent. It is contagious among people who share inputs, same media, same packaging, same slogans, because their reconstructive engines are trained on the same data. And it is meaningful. The detail you defend is usually attached to a value, an identity claim, a personal myth. You are not arguing about a logo. You are arguing about the trustworthiness of your internal witness. From another angle, the wrong memory is the price we pay for a system optimized, not for accuracy, but for usefulness. A mind that saved everything vertically would drown in retrieval. A mind that abstracts and predicts can act, improvise, and tell stories. It will also occasionally choose a past that is more functional than factual. The marvel is that we notice. The affront you feel when contradicted is the healthy friction between two checksums, the world's and your own. That friction teaches you where you draw your map in more detail than the terrain warrants, shows you which features, names, tunes, glances, your model treats as sacred. If there is a practical moral hidden inside the theory, it's gentle. You can hold two truths at once, that your memory feels exact because it is exquisitely integrated, and that integration does not guarantee correspondence. You can enjoy the eerie elegance of an alternate past without needing to enthrone it, and you can let the dissonance do its real work, which is to reveal how reality is constructed for you. Through compression, prediction, storytelling, and the social weave. The wrong memory isn't a failure. It's a glimpse of the engine room. It reminds you that the past you carry is a living document, one that edits itself to keep the present coherent. Sometimes it edits in a flourish that no one else can see. Sometimes that flourish is the most interesting part. Repeating days. The repeating day is the conviction that the world has queued up the same sequence twice. The same greeting at the door in the same cadence. The same notification chime. At the same moment you reach for the kettle. The same offhand remark from a stranger that you remember hearing yesterday in the same place with the same light afternoon light. It is not mere routine or the gentle rhythm of habit. It is the sharper feeling that the timeline has been replayed, not just rhymed. The fascination sits in the word exact, because ordinary life rarely offers perfect duplicates. So, how could exactness arise in a world of noise? Begin with the brain as a compression engine. Perception does not stream raw pixels into awareness. It builds a compressed, semantic sketch that keeps what is useful and discards most of the microscopic variation. This sketching happens through event segmentation. The mind chops the day into units: leaving the house, starting the car, opening the inbox, and tags each unit with gist-level descriptors. When 2 days generate the same tags in the same order, with similar boundary cues, compression channel outputs an internal representation close enough to be treated as identical. The external world may differ in countless subpixel ways, but the code inside your head compares representations rather than photons. If the code crosses a similarity threshold, the judgment this is the same day becomes available. Prediction sharpens the illusion. The brain runs a continuous simulation one step ahead of the world. When it expects a certain sound, it dampens the surprise when the sound arrives. And when it expects a certain sentence, it fills in words before they are spoken. In a highly predictable environment, same interfaces, same small talk, the simulator can get far out in front and pre-fill entire scenes. The live data then merely confirms what was already painted. On repeat day 2, the simulator reuses the prior day's scaffold almost wholesale because it worked yesterday. The subjective result is a glide across events that feel pre-lived, not as déjà vu flashes, but as continuous déjà. Not a momentary echo, but an extended certainty that you have been in this exact unfolding before. Memory reconsolidation supplies another gear. Each time you recall yesterday, you edit yesterday, strengthening some transitions and shaving others. If you reconstruct a clean sequence, this lead to that, then this, then that, the cleaner sequence can overwrite the messy original. Now, when today begins to resemble the polished trace, the match is tighter than any messy reality ever was. The memory's idealization becomes a magnet, and today's coarse-grained features snap to it, producing the eerie fit that feels like duplication. In this view, exact same way, is not a statement about microhistory. It is a statement about how memory prefers simple causal arcs and will enforce them when circumstances allow. Habit loops amplify the effect. Routines chunk actions into single units that execute with minimal conscious oversight. When a loop runs, subtle sensory differences are gated out because they are irrelevant to the loop's goal. Two looped mornings, even with distinct details, are internally sparse in the same places. What survives awareness is the invariant path through the decision tree. You remember the branch points coffee or tea, car or train, and forget the leaves? If the branch points resolve the same way, your remembered day collapses to the same skeleton, which your mind experiences as the identical day. Temporal resolution contributes a further trick. Time in consciousness is sampled, not continuous. During saccades and attentional shifts, the system fills gaps. During high load, it lengthens some moments and compresses others. If stress, sleep debt, or overstimulation coarsen your sampling window, then two stretches of life that share only their major beats will quantize to the same sequence. Your internal clock snaps both days to the same grid. At that point, the claim of exactness is again about your sampling rate. Turn the dial to higher fidelity, and the sameness dissolves. Leave it coarse, and the equivalence feels perfect. There's also the ecology of modern life. Algorithmic curation and institutional schedules synchronize our days far more tightly than we notice. The same playlist surfaces at the same hour, the same content creators post on cadence, the same calendar nudges fire for you and for thousands of others, the same traffic lights are timed to the same flows. A city becomes a metronome. In such environments, the joint distribution of triggers aligns across days, increasing the chance that two independent runs through the world will collide on the same cues in the same order. The miracle is not that days repeat, is that we usually feel they don't. Neurologically, a few transient states can tilt the system toward repetition. Mild dissociation reduces novelty tagging. Migraine aura and temporal lobe irritability can saturate the sense of familiarity. Stress hormones promote habitual responding over flexible exploration. Combine any of these with a day designed for predictability. You get a phenomenology of replay. The feeling of sliding into a groove cut by your own behavior yesterday. Crucially, the feeling is calm rather than hallucinatory, because every event is plausible and locally consistent. What is odd is their alignment. Philosophically, it is tempting to literalize. Block universe view says every day is fixed. Your experience of again would simply be your awareness catching up to the fact that two segments of the world line are isomorphic. A many worlds gloss imagines that branches fan out, but occasionally return to states indistinguishable to an embedded observer. You perceive a loop because your course variables match, even though the microstates differ. A simulation story suggests periodic checkpointing and rollback. When the system corrects an error, it replays from the last stable save, and a few agents with tight priors for trivial details detect the redundancy.
These metaphors are powerful because they match the felt structured global coherence with local deja, but they are not required.
The mind alone can generate the same structure by compressing, predicting, and reusing. The insistence on exact same way deserves scrutiny. Exactness here is an internal metric. Two experiences are exact if the differences fall beneath the threshold of the features you track. Think of language. Two sentences with different synonyms can feel identical if they preserve rhythm, intent, and outcome. Think of music. Two live takes differ in microtiming, but can register as the same performance to a non-musician. Everyday perception treats the world like language and music. It seeks invariance. When it finds them in the same order, with the same boundary cues, it declares identity. That declaration is not deceit. It is how cognition saves energy. Still, the effect teaches. Repeating day exposes what your model of the world cares about. If your sense of sameness survives a friend wearing different shoes, but would shatter if they greeted you with a different intonation, you have learned that you encode voices more richly than clothing. If the loop breaks when you take a different path to the bus, but not when the sky changes color with the weather, you have discovered which environmental variables anchor your narrative of time. In that way, the phenomenon is diagnostic. It reveals the alphabet of your day. The few letters that permuted can spell almost every story you tell yourself about living. The unsettling edge, the suspicion that time itself is stuck, may be the mind's way of motivating escape from local minima. Attractors in behavior space are efficient but sterile. The cognitive system seeks novelty both to learn and to maintain agency. Feeling trapped in a loop is the cost function complaining. The moment you perturb one boundary condition, change the order of morning steps. Inject a new conversation, walk on the other side of the street. The model must recompile, and the spell breaks. That you can break it so easily is evidence that the loop was an internal alignment more than a cosmic rerun. But the fact that it can form at all, and feel so complete, is the reminder the theory provides. Identity and time in everyday life are mostly products of compression. When the compression pipeline runs twice on similar input, it will often emit the same day. Sudden reality shift. The sudden reality shift is the sensation that the world is still recognizably yours, yet misaligned by a fraction. As if some hidden coordinate changed and everything snapped into a nearby configuration. The fascination of it comes from how precise the feeling is. Not the unfamiliarity of travel or the vertigo of panic, but a crisp conviction that the continuity of your life has been conserved, while certain edges have been redrawn. Street looks half a meter wider, a friend's inflection is off by a beat, a childhood photo displays a detail you'd swear was never there. The mind supplies language like slipping, branching, phasing, because what is being noticed is not chaos but a suspiciously coherent alternative. One way to model the effect is to treat perception as a generative prediction machine. Your brain constantly guesses what the next millisecond of reality will contain and compares the guess to the incoming data. Ordinarily, prediction errors are small and get resolved silently. A sudden reality shift would be the rare case when the error is large, globally consistent, and resolves in favor of a new model rather than updating the old one. You're not just surprised that the mug moved. You acquire a new equilibrium in which the mug's position is natural, and your old equilibrium feels like a memory artifact. The felt shift is the phase transition between predictive regimes. This is similar to how a face suddenly pops out of a noisy image. Once the higher-level hypothesis locks in, the entire lower-level evidence reorganizes under it, and the old interpretation becomes hard to reclaim. Memory contributes a second mechanism. Autobiographical memory isn't a video archive. It is reconstructed at retrieval and then saved again. Each act of remembering is also an act of slight rewriting. For retrieval recruits a neighboring trace, say, similar apartment layout from a different year, the merged memory can be cleaner than either original and feel more certain. When that consolidation completes, the world outside appears to have changed to disagree with your perfectly clear recollection. This is not simple forgetfulness. It is a Bayesian bet your brain makes about which past would make the present most coherent. The bet can be wrong in ways that produce the eerie conviction of having slid sideways into a near-duplicate history. Temporal processing adds another lever. The brain stitches perception across microgaps using saccadic suppression, chronostasis, and other timing hacks. Those stitches slip, the continuity illusion fractures for a beat, and is then reassembled with a slightly different alignment. The feeling is not I hallucinated, but the film jumped a frame and resumed, which maps neatly onto reports of stepping across an invisible seam. Because the reconstruction is global, a dozen small incongruities can appear at once. A clock seems off. The air feels different. A familiar route has a not-quite-right curvature. The world hasn't moved. The stitching pattern has. There is also a social cognitive route. Shared language crystallizes states that were previously diffuse. The popularity of terms like Mandela effect or timeline shifting gives people a ready-made frame for indexing anomalies. That frame recruits attentional bias. Once you're tracking for near misses with memory, base rate coincidences convert into evidence of displacement. The frame also recodes the natural fuzziness of categories, logo variants, lyric mishearings, regional spellings, and two unitary proofs. None of this means the experience is trivial. Rather, it underscores that meaning-making is part of the mechanism. The label selects the features that will be experienced as a shift and binds them into a story of transition. A neurological account can push deeper without reducing the wonder. Limbic temporal systems regulate familiarity and salience, brief perturbations, stress hormones, sleep deprivation. Microcisor-like activity in temporal cortex, migraine aura, vestibular conflict scan, decouple familiarity from content.
Ow.
When the familiarity signal spikes for a pattern that deviates from your stored template, the brain resolves the contradiction by inferring that the template, not the sensation, needs revision. The result is a calm but powerful narrative. The world has updated to a nearby version in which these odd features are the correct ones. Dissociation and derealization sit on this spectrum as trait-like or state-like tendencies for the eye to loosen relative to the scene, making model switches easier and more noticeable. There is a philosophical reading that takes the feeling at face value. If the many worlds picture of quantum mechanics is interpreted naively at macro scales, every measurement proliferates branches. Your current experience is one thread among countless near neighbors. On this view, the sudden reality shift is not detecting quantum branching decoherence, keeps branches from interfering, but it is how a human narrative mind might metabolize the sheer contingency of the present. You wake into awareness that a tiny hinge could have swung otherwise, and because the alternatives are structurally similar, the contrast feels like a translation into a parallel draft. The metaphysics does not require physical hopping. The mind supplies the hop as a metaphor, because it is better at stories than at Hilbert spaces. The simulation hypothesis offers a different literalization. If reality is substrate computation, large-scale state compression, rollback after error, or live patching could in principle produce discontinuities that keep macroscopics consistent, but nick the margins fonts, colors, idioms, the exact angle of a staircase. Most of the time, compression is lossless at human scales. Rarely a collision of optimizations yields a minimal delta state that is not exactly the same as the previous state, but is within tolerance for all embedded agents except the few who keep unusually tight priors for specific details. Those agents report a shift. In this model, the eerie calm that accompanies many reports is predicted. The patch is consistent. Only the checksum in your private archive throws a warning. Ace. Time symmetric or block universe views suggest yet another angle. If the present is the intersection of constraints from past and future, then changes to future boundary conditions could, in principle, force a resolve of the path that led here, as long as macroscopic continuity remains intact. The subjective correlate of such a resolve would be precisely the sense that the path is the same, but certain intermediate specifics have been recast. The feeling of an unshakable alteration fits the intuition that constraints have tightened, not that noise has increased. These models are not mutually exclusive, and their predictions overlap in ways that match the phenomenology. They all expect local coherence after the shift, not chaos. They all predict that what changes will cluster at the periphery of your attention or at boundaries defined by categorization, names, spellings, superficial features that carry low utility for most tasks, but high identity weight for specific individuals. They all expect individual differences. People with more rigid internal models or more precise episodic indexing will detect smaller deviations. Others will never notice anything. The testability problem is central. If the world genuinely altered, evidence would be scarce. And the few who shared your original configuration might be distributed across networks that prevent convergence. If the shift is internal, independent witnesses should not corroborate your details beyond chance and bias. Yet even that is messy because co-witnesses share memories, language, and media, entangling their reconstructions. One practical probe is persistence. Internal remappings tend to soften with time as the new model becomes dominant or as counterexamples accumulate. External changes would remain crisp. Another is load. Sleep restoration, hydration, and reducing stress hormones should reduce internal shifts. They should not affect external ones. A third is invariance. Certain anchors mathematical facts, archival documents, physical artifacts in your possessions serve as guardrails. If your sense of change implicates them and you can check them, the result is informative either way. The ethics of explanation matters because the experience is often deeply meaningful. Dismissing it as faulty memory misses what it signals, the mind announcing with unusual clarity that the glue of reality is an active construction. Equally, declaring it proof of cosmic tampering can overfit a local mystery into a universal law. The most fruitful posture treats the shift as data about how models, a lot of memories and meanings, negotiate control of consciousness. Even if every instance ultimately lands on the side of brain dynamics, the phenomenon teaches something profound about world-making. Continuity is not given. It is achieved, and sometimes it is achieved by changing the template rather than the input. If you adopt the theory as a working tool, it can be used without forcing a metaphysical decision. You can watch for precursors in attention and state fatigue, sensory saturation, strong emotion, ambient anomalies, and recognize the early warning. Prediction errors are accumulating. You can deliberately slow the model switch by sampling more data, naming fewer assumptions, and letting the old and new interpretations coexist before commitment. You can also treat the felt shift as an epistemic gift. It reveals which features you considered part of the bedrock. Often, what feels altered carries an identity load. The shift outsources a question you weren't asking. What are the true invariants of your world? In the end, the sudden reality shift is a precise phenomenological report. The world is self-similar across versions, and you briefly felt the hinge between them. Whether the hinge lies in neurons, mathematics, or code. The sensation draws a boundary around the ordinary magic of being an agent inside a continuous, revisable model. It is not proof of anything beyond itself, but it is a door into how easily the same life can be recast by a tiny turn of the frame. And that, perhaps, is why it lingers, because once you have felt the seam, you cannot unlearn that seams exist. Technology acting impossible. You pick up your phone, expecting the inert, dark screen of a device drained of life. The battery icon was empty minutes ago. You saw the familiar dead screen, the frozen unresponsiveness that signals powerlessness. And yet, in an instant, without any external input, without connection to a charger or power source, the device flickers to life. Icons illuminate. Notifications appear. The home screen hums with digital vitality, and your mind races to reconcile this sudden anomaly. The event feels impossible, a rupture in the expected order of cause and effect. A moment when technology behaves as though it has a will or consciousness of its own. This is the phenomenon of technology acting impossible, where the normally predictable behavior of devices, phones, computers, watches, seems to defy physics, probability, and human understanding. At the heart of the phenomenon is a collision between expectation, observation, and the complexity of modern electronics. Devices are not simply passive objects. They are intricate systems of hardware and software, circuits and code, power regulation, and autonomous processes. Even when a battery reads 0, residual charge may linger in capacitors, microbatteries, or internal circuitry, sufficient to allow a brief resurgence of function. Software routines designed to manage power, preserve memory, or trigger fail-safes can spontaneously execute when conditions align, creating the illusion that a dead device has resurrected itself. From the outside, these events are inexplicable, but they are rooted in the unpredictable interplay of voltage fluctuations, firmware behavior, and the idiosyncrasies of electronic components. The perceptual and psychological dimensions amplify the uncanny effect. Humans are accustomed to precise cause and effect relationships with technology. Dead battery equals dead phone. When this expectation is violated, the brain interprets it as a genuine anomaly. The event is intensified by the suddenness and apparent impossibility. The mind, attuned to patterns and rules, experiences a momentary rupture of reality. Cognitive dissonance arises because your understanding of the device's physical limitations conflicts with the perceptual evidence of its revival. The brain, striving for coherence, may even inject narrative significance. Was the device predicting your need, responding to intention, or acting with hidden agency? Predictive coding plays a subtle role in the experience. The brain continuously anticipates sensory outcomes based on prior knowledge. When technology behaves within predictable bounds, perception aligns effortlessly with expectation. A sudden, impossible event violates these models, triggering heightened attention, emotional arousal, and a focus on anomaly detection. This cognitive spotlight magnifies the experience, transforming a minor glitch into a moment of profound strangeness. The discrepancy between expectation and observation becomes the primary stimulus. Engaging memory, pattern recognition, and reasoning centers simultaneously. Residual electrical phenomena are often implicated in these events. The lithium-ion batteries, for example, can exhibit nonlinear voltage behavior. Tiny residual currents may accumulate in circuits during apparent inactivity and once certain thresholds are met. Components may reactivate microprocessors, triggering a screen wake or background task that manifests as a spontaneous resurrection. Software errors, automated updates, or processes programmed to wake the device under specific conditions can compound the effect, making it appear as if the phone has defied physics. The unpredictability of these interactions, combined with human interpretation, produces the impression of impossibility. The emotional dimension of the experience is amplified by its rarity and contextual significance. A sudden phone revival often occurs when the mind is preoccupied, anxious, or in need of information, precisely when the event feels meaningful. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures, and a device awakening just when needed resonates with cognitive biases, enhancing the sense of mystery or synchronicity. The uncanny mix of expectation, violation, technical plausibility, and emotional context creates a moment that feels more than mere coincidence. It feels alive, purposeful, and impossible. Cultural narratives deepen the resonance of the phenomenon. Stories of objects behaving autonomously, machines exhibiting agency, or electronics coming alive pervade folklore, literature, and modern media. The event taps into these archetypes, merging the familiar with the inexplicable. Even if logically understood, a sensation carries emotional and cognitive weight. It evokes wonder, unease, and the impression that the boundaries between human intention and technological action are more permeable than assumed. Ultimately, technology acting impossible reveals the intersection of physics, engineering, perception, and expectation. It demonstrates that human experience is not solely dictated by objective reality, but shaped by the predictive frameworks and emotional salience through which we interpret the world. A dead phone turning on without charging is not merely an electrical curiosity, it is a window into how perception, probability, and cognition interact to produce the uncanny. In that moment, the ordinary predictability of machines is suspended, and the familiar becomes enigmatic. A reminder that even the most understood systems can produce experiences that challenge our assumptions, captivate our attention, and momentarily blur the line between impossibility and reality. Mirror lag. You stand before a mirror, perhaps brushing your hair, adjusting your posture, or simply glancing at your own expression, and something is off. Your reflection hesitates, a fraction of a second behind. The movement's delayed just enough to create an unsettling, almost impossible sensation. Your arm rises, and the mirrored hand follows a heartbeat later. Your eyes blink, and the reflection trails by an imperceptible, yet jarring interval. This is mirror lag, a phenomenon where the familiar feedback of a reflective surface seems temporarily displaced, warping the normally instantaneous connection between self and image. It is subtle but profoundly disorienting, shaking the intuitive sense that the world mirrors your actions in perfect synchrony. At its core, mirror lag is a vivid illustration of the delicate timing between perception, motor execution, and sensory feedback. The human brain continuously integrates incoming sensory information to construct a coherent experience of self in space and time. Visual input from the eyes is processed through the retina and relayed via the optic nerve to the primary visual cortex, then distributed to associative areas that coordinate motion perception, spatial mapping, and self-recognition. Simultaneously, the motor cortex dispatches signals to muscles to enact movement, while proprioceptive and vestibular systems track the body's position and trajectory. Normally, the integration of visual, tactile, motor information is so seamless that reflections appear perfectly synchronized, creating the familiar, stable feedback of mirrored movement. But in mirror lag, subtle misalignments arise through momentary processing delays, neurological disruptions, or perceptual misattribution, producing the sensation of a temporal gap between self and image. Predictive coding helps explain the subjective intensity of the experience. The brain does not passively wait for sensory feedback, constantly generates forward models, predicting the expected visual outcome of one's actions. When the reflection does not match the predicted motion, the brain registers a conflict, triggering the uncanny sensation of delayed movement. Even minimal temporal discrepancies, mere tens of milliseconds, can be magnified perceptually, because the neural circuits responsible for integrating self-motion and visual input are finely tuned to anticipate near-perfect synchrony. The mismatch is interpreted not as a simple sensory delay, but as a violation of the expected causal relationship between action and reflection, creating a feeling of instability or unreality. Environmental and physiological factors can accentuate the effect. Low light, reflective imperfections, or slight distortions in the mirror can alter the perception of timing. Fatigue, distraction, stress, or even transient neurological phenomena such as microseizures or shifts in cortical excitability can slow or misalign sensory processing, producing the impression of a lag. Vestibular or proprioceptive imbalances can also subtly distort the perception of one's own movement relative to the mirror, making the discrepancy more salient. In combination, these variables create a perceptual illusion so compelling that the reflection seems almost autonomous, a separate entity that trails or anticipates the body in uncanny fashion. The psychological impact of mirror lag is intensified by the mirror's symbolic and cognitive significance. Mirrors serve as immediate, detailed feedback of selfhood, integrating visual, emotional, and social dimensions. When the reflection no longer conforms to the expected real-time image, it undermines the brain's model of the self, creating unease, fascination, or even fear. The delayed reflection evokes the uncanny valley of identity. It is you, unmistakably, yet not you in the present moment. The discrepancy between expectation and perception taps into deep cognitive and emotional circuits, triggering attention, arousal, and heightened awareness of one's own body and its spatial continuity. Cultural and narrative frameworks amplify the eerie resonance of the experience. Folklore, literature, and film frequently depict mirrors as portals, thresholds, or spaces where time and identity can be distorted. The notion that a reflection can lag, move independently, or deviate subtly from reality resonates with stories of doubles, spirits, or parallel worlds. The effect is psychologically compelling because it transforms a mundane, everyday object into a site of potential anomaly, forcing the observer to confront the fragile assumptions underlying perception, causality, and embodiment. Ultimately, mirror lag illuminates the remarkable precision and vulnerability of human perception. It demonstrates how visual feedback, motor planning, predictive modeling, and proprioception are interwoven to create the seamless experience of self. A momentary temporal displacement disrupts this integration, revealing the complexity beneath ordinary experience and producing an uncanny, almost supernatural sensation. In that brief instant, the reflection is no longer a simple copy, but an entity with a slight autonomy, a visual echo that trails the self just enough to remind us that reality, perception, and identity are finely tuned constructions, vulnerable to the slightest shifts in timing and attention. The phenomenon is a reminder that our experience of immediacy is not absolute. At that, even something as intimate and familiar as a reflection can betray a subtle dissonance, and that the boundaries between self-image and time are far more malleable than they appear. Ghostly cold spots. You step into a room, a hallway, or a quiet corner, and suddenly a patch of air feels impossibly cold, a shiver crawling along your spine, skin prickling in response to a chill that seems to exist only where you stand. The rest of the space remains at normal temperature, objects unaltered, no draft, no open window, no malfunctioning HVAC system. The sensation is brief but unmistakable, a concentrated pocket of cold that seems almost sentient in its specificity. This is the phenomenon known as ghostly cold spots, an experience that has fascinated, unnerved, and mystified humans for centuries. Unlike general drops in temperature, these chills are localized to a small, discrete area, often associated with rooms, corners, doorways, or particular objects, creating a tangible sense that a hidden presence has intruded into the immediate environment. At the physiological level, the sensation arises from a complex interplay of sensory perception, nervous system responsiveness, and environmental interpretation. Thermoreceptors in the skin and deeper tissues constantly monitor changes in temperature, sending signals through the peripheral nervous system to the hypothalamus, which integrates thermal input, and generates conscious perception of warmth or cold. These receptors are exquisitely sensitive, capable of detecting fractional differences in ambient temperature, air movement, or humidity. However, the brain does not passively record these inputs, it actively interprets them, factoring in context, expectation, and prior experience. In ghostly cold spots, minor environmental variations, a brief current of cooler air, subtle differences in surface temperature, even shifts in infrared radiation can be amplified by the central nervous system into a vivid, localized chill, perceived as uncanny or inexplicable. Predictive coding and expectation further shape the experience. The human brain constantly models the world, anticipating sensory input based on context, memory, and environmental cues. In spaces culturally or psychologically associated with the supernatural, such as old houses, empty corridors, or historically charged locations, the mind's anticipatory mechanisms are highly active. Even minor stimuli, a draft slipping through a gap, the thermal inertia of a stone floor, or the subtle cooling effect of air pressure differences, can be interpreted as an abrupt and localized chill, because the brain is primed to detect unusual or meaningful events in these contexts. The perception of a ghostly cold spot is enhanced, vivid, and emotionally charged. Neurophysiologically, the experience is linked to the somatosensory system and its interaction with the limbic structures that encode emotion and arousal. Chills and shivers are accompanied by involuntary muscle contractions, piloerection, and heightened autonomic nervous system activity. These responses are closely tied to fear, awe, or surprise, producing a full-body awareness that reinforces the sensation of an external agent acting upon the body. Even in the absence of a true drop in temperature, the combination of context, anticipation, and autonomic response produces the unmistakable feeling of a cold spot, localized as though the environment itself is subtly animated. Environmental microvariations often contribute in subtle ways. Differences in material composition, airflow, humidity, and thermal conductivity can create pockets of cooler air or surfaces that are not readily perceptible to measurement devices. For example, stone floors, drafty corners, or high ceilings can produce transient microclimates, accentuated by slight movements of air or shifts in atmospheric pressure. These physical variations are interpreted by the brain as sudden, localized chills, particularly when attention is focused on that specific spot. In essence, the sensation is both real and amplified, a combination of minor environmental cues and the brain's active construction of perceptual reality. Psychological factors amplify the uncanny aspect of ghostly cold spots. Humans are predisposed to assign significance to anomalies, especially in contexts associated with the unknown or the supernatural. Fear, expectation, or even narrative suggestion can heighten the sensitivity of thermal perception, making a minor cooling effect feel concentrated, intense, and meaningful. The phenomenon is emotionally salient because it violates the ordinary expectation of uniform ambient temperature and normal environmental behavior, producing a perceptual anomaly that the mind interprets as potentially meaningful or even intentional. Culturally, ghostly cold spots have long been associated with spirits, hauntings, or presences beyond the material world. Literature, folklore, and anecdotal reports consistently describe sudden, localized chills as indicators of unseen entities or liminal encounters. While modern science interprets the phenomenon in terms of sensory processing, microclimatic effects, and cognitive expectation, the emotional and narrative resonance of the experience remains powerful. The localized nature of the sensation, concentrated in a single corner near a doorway or above a stairland, creates a tangible axis of attention, making the presence feel deliberate, directed, and alive. Ultimately, ghostly cold spots illuminate the intersection of physiology, perception, and environment. They reveal the brain's capacity to amplify, interpret, and assign significance to subtle stimuli, creating experiences that feel immediate, localized, and profoundly uncanny. The phenomenon underscores how sensory input, neural processing, and expectation converge to construct reality, demonstrating that even a brief, concentrated chill is more than a mere temperature fluctuation. It is an embodied encounter with the extraordinary precision of human perception. It's the emotional weight of expectation and the enduring mystery of the spaces we inhabit. In these moments, a small, unseen corner of the world seems to hold its own atmosphere, and the mind is forced to acknowledge that reality is not only measured by physics, but by the interpretive, anticipatory machinery of consciousness itself. Implausible survival. You are walking down a busy street, standing near a staircase, or navigating a chaotic situation when a sudden event occurs: a falling object, a speeding bicycle, a misstep on uneven ground, a car swerving unexpectedly, and you emerge completely unscathed. Your heart races, adrenaline floods your system, and disbelief washes over you. By all logical accounts, you should have been injured, yet somehow you were spared. This is implausible survival, the uncanny experience of escaping harm in circumstances where probability, physics, and ordinary expectations suggest you should have suffered consequences. The event is often fleeting, leaving the mind both exhilarated and unnerved. A vivid reminder of the precarious interplay between chance, perception, and bodily reflex. The phenomenon begins in the interaction of sensory perception, predictive processing, and motor response. The human brain is constantly monitoring the environment for threats, integrating visual, auditory, and proprioceptive inputs to generate rapid predictions and guide immediate action. Specialized neural circuits in the cerebellum and basal ganglia orchestrate milliseconds-long adjustments in posture, limb placement, and balance, while the motor cortex prepares responses to anticipated hazards. In moments of near danger, these systems operate at peak efficiency, sometimes producing seemingly miraculous evasions. A stumble is corrected before the foot fully misses a step. A hand jerks away from an approaching object before it contacts the skin, or the body twists in mid-motion to avoid collision. These reflexive adjustments are usually unconscious, but an implausible survival. They occur with perfect timing, giving the sensation of narrowly escaping fate. Probability and chance are also central to the experience. Daily life presents countless opportunities for minor mishaps, yet most pass unnoticed because human reflexes and attention compensate automatically. Implausible survival highlights the extraordinary alignment of multiple variables, the precise trajectory of an object, the timing of the body's movement, the responsiveness of muscles and joints so that despite apparent danger, no harm occurs. Statistically, improbable alignment is inevitable across many trials in life. But the rarity and immediacy of each event make it feel profoundly meaningful and almost supernatural. The mind interprets the survival as uncanny because it juxtaposes the ordinary expectation of injury against an outcome that defies statistical intuition. Physiological arousal enhances the likelihood and perception of survival. Adrenaline and noradrenaline surge through the bloodstream in response to sudden threat, heightening sensory sensitivity, accelerating reaction times, and amplifying muscular power. Pupils dilate, heart rate spikes, and the vestibular system becomes acutely attuned to orientation and balance. This fight-or-flight state primes the body to execute rapid, precise corrections that may otherwise be impossible under normal conditions. In the moments immediately following, the clarity of perception is heightened. Details that would normally blur are registered in sharp relief, reinforcing the sense of improbability and the vividness of the event. Cognitive framing plays a crucial role in how implausible survival is experienced. The brain continuously constructs narratives to make sense of events, interpreting outcomes in light of prior knowledge, expectation, and emotion. Surviving an accident that should have caused injury is encoded as a remarkable event, often accompanied by intense emotional tagging, relief, awe, fear, or gratitude. Memory consolidates these events preferentially, making them feel larger and more improbable in hindsight. The narrative may frame the escape as luck, divine intervention, innate skill, or sheer chance, even when the underlying mechanisms are entirely natural and comprehensible in physiological and probabilistic terms. Attentional focus also shapes perception. In situations of sudden danger, attention narrows dramatically, filtering extraneous stimuli and concentrating resources on imminent threats. This heightened state allows micro-adjustments in movement and perception that would be unnoticed in ordinary circumstances. The brain prioritizes processing of the relevant sensory cues: motion, speed, direction, texture, orchestrates reflexive corrections with remarkable precision. When the event resolves without injury, the combination of focused attention, rapid motor execution, and the inherent unpredictability of the environment produces the uncanny sense of survival against all odds. Cultural and psychological interpretations magnify the phenomenon. Key implausible survival has long been interpreted as a sign of destiny, protection, or extraordinary skill. Stories of narrow escapes in literature, folklore, modern media tap into the same neural and emotional pathways, reinforcing the intensity and memorability of the experience. Psychologically, the brain seeks meaning in events that appear statistically improbable, creating a narrative of personal significance or cosmic alignment. Even without invoking fate or mysticism, the experience highlights the remarkable precision and adaptability of human perception, reflexes, and cognition. Ultimately, implausible survival reveals the delicate interplay between chance, neural prediction, and bodily execution. It demonstrates how finely tuned sensory, motor, and cognitive systems interact to navigate a world full of hazards, and how rare alignments of timing and probability can produce outcomes that feel miraculous. The fleeting moments of escape are as much about perception as physics. The mind reconstructs and amplifies the improbability, rendering survival not merely a physical event, but a deeply felt, emotionally charged encounter with the unexpected precision of the human body and brain. In these moments, reality itself seems to bend slightly, reminding us that life is a continuous negotiation between risk, perception, and the extraordinary mechanics of existence. Eerie synchronicity. You are walking through a room, scrolling through your phone, or sipping coffee at a cafe, when a thought suddenly arises in your mind. Word, a phrase, a name, a fleeting image, and almost instantly it is mirrored back to you from the world outside. A friend utters it. A notification pings it, a sign displays it, or a conversation nearby seems to echo precisely the thought you had just conceived. The experience is jarring because it gives the impression that your mind and the external world are momentarily in lockstep, that your private cognition has somehow bled into shared reality. This is eerie synchronicity, a phenomenon that exposes the delicate and uncanny interplay between expectation, attention, probability, and perception, leaving the mind oscillating between astonishment, disbelief, and a creeping sense of significance. At the neurological core of the experience lies the brain's pattern recognition machinery. Humans are fundamentally predictive creatures. The cortex continuously scans the environment, detects regularities, and anticipates outcomes. The moment a thought surfaces, a complex network of associations and expectations is activated, priming the brain to recognize related stimuli in the immediate surroundings. When a coincidental occurrence aligns with the primed pattern, someone saying the same word you just thought, the predictive system rapidly registers it, and the brain amplifies its salience. It feels extraordinary not because the coincidence itself is necessarily improbable, but because the cognitive system interprets it as meaningful, highlighting its unexpected synchrony against the background of ordinary events. Cognitive psychology explains much of the effect through attentional bias and selective perception. The human brain is constantly inundated with sensory data, much of which passes unnoticed. When you think of a word or phrase, your attention is sharply tuned to any occurrence of that word in your environment. Prior to the thought, the same stimuli may have passed by unnoticed. Once your neural networks are primed, even faint or brief instances of the word or phrase are catapulted into conscious awareness. The result is a vivid sense of coincidence. The world seems to respond instantaneously to your inner cognition, when in reality your perception has simply filtered and amplified a previously unnoticed signal. Memory and retrospective construction play a crucial role as well. Eerie synchronicities are often remembered with heightened clarity because they violate expectations and carry emotional weight. The brain encodes these events as exceptional, sometimes even as if they were foreseen or fated. While discounting the countless times that thoughts and external events do not align, this selective encoding creates a skewed narrative. The coincidences feel far more frequent and meaningful than statistical probability would suggest. The mind instinctively seeks patterns and meaning, so a single synchronous moment becomes a vivid anchor in memory, reinforcing the impression that thought and reality are momentarily entwined. Probability and chance also underpin the phenomenon. Many synchronicities are mathematically inevitable, when one considers the number of thoughts humans generate and the amount of information present in daily life. With tens of thousands of potential stimuli and a constant flow of thoughts, occasional alignment is almost guaranteed. Yet the brain is not content to see it as random. The rarity of the experience within the perceived subjective flow of time enhances its emotional and cognitive impact. The result is the uncanny feeling that the universe is responding, reflecting, or even anticipating the mind's private contents. Emotional and psychological states amplify the perception. Heightened arousal, stress, curiosity, or desire for significance makes the brain more sensitive to pattern detection. When a thought carries emotional weight, concern about a friend, an idea for a project, a question you hope to answer at the moment of synchronicity is more intense, registering with almost preternatural clarity. Emotional salience recruits limbic circuitry, which increases attention, strengthens memory encoding, and heightens the sense of importance, transforming a simple coincidence into an event that feels almost fated. Subtle environmental cues contribute further. Social interactions, prior conversations, visual stimuli, and textual hints constantly prepare the mind to anticipate particular words or phrases. A glance at a sign, a fragment of overheard speech, or a remembered discussion can prime the brain to expect certain words. When these expectations are met immediately, the alignment feels uncanny. Precision of timing is critical. The closer the external occurrence follows the internal thought, the more it defies intuitive notions of chance and amplifies the perception of synchronicity. The brain interprets temporal proximity as causal or significant, even in the absence of an actual link. Cultural and symbolic frameworks magnify the experience. Human societies have long attached significance to coincidences, interpreting them as omens, messages, or evidence of hidden connections between minds and worlds. Even in secular contexts, synchronicities resonate because they appear to violate ordinary causality and temporal expectations. The phenomenon evokes the uncanny, producing a sense of connectedness, premonition, or hidden order that feels profoundly meaningful, whether or not a rational explanation exists. Ultimately, eerie synchronicity reveals the extraordinary sensitivity and constructive power of the human mind. It demonstrates that perception, attention, expectation, and memory work together to create a coherent narrative of reality, one that is constantly interpreting, predicting, and assigning meaning. When thought and external occurrence align, the normally invisible scaffolding of cognition becomes evident. The brain highlights coincidence as exceptional, rendering the ordinary extraordinary. The fleeting sensation is a window into the architecture of awareness, showing how consciousness threads together internal and external worlds, and how even chance events can feel like conscious resonance between mind and reality, leaving the observer with a shiver of awe at the mysterious harmony of perception and experience. Reverse echoes. You are walking down a hallway, sitting in a cafe, or standing in a park, when a voice seems to arrive before it should. You hear a word, a phrase, a laugh, or a warning, just moments before the person articulates it, as if the sound has traveled backward through time to reach your ears in advance. This is the phenomenon known as reverse echoes, an uncanny temporal mismatch in auditory perception where the brain experiences speech or sound before it has physically occurred. The sensation is subtle yet jarring, destabilizing the fundamental assumption that cause precedes effect. It leaves the mind oscillating between skepticism, awe, and a creeping sense of unreality. At the neurological level, reverse echoes are tied to the brain's extraordinary predictive machinery. The auditory system does not merely register sound, it anticipates it. Neurons in the auditory cortex and associated predictive networks are constantly generating forward models, estimating the likely timing, pitch, and rhythm of incoming sounds based on context, prior experience, and subtle cues from speakers' mouths, gestures, and breathing. When someone is about to speak, micro-movements of the lips, shifts in posture, changes in breathing are detected unconsciously by the observer, allowing the brain to pre-activate neural representations of the anticipated sound. This predictive coding mechanism is highly adaptive, improving reaction times, facilitating conversation, and aiding comprehension in noisy environments. But it can occasionally overshoot, producing the perception of a word or sound arriving before it is actually spoken. Tension and expectation further amplify the phenomenon. The brain is constantly allocating cognitive resources to salient stimuli, and speech is inherently significant for human survival and social interaction. When you are focused on a conversation or listening intently, your auditory cortex is primed to detect patterns, anticipate phrasing, and extrapolate meaning from partial signals. Even minimal custensing of vocal cords, inhalation, or the subtle shaping of the mouth can trigger the brain to hear the expected sound in advance. The experience is heightened if the speaker is familiar or emotionally relevant, because the brain invests additional predictive resources in processing their anticipated words. The result is an eerily convincing reverse echo, a phantom voice that precedes reality. Temporal processing in the brain is also imperfect. Neural signals are not transmitted instantaneously. They are subject to conduction delays, synaptic processing, and integration across multiple cortical regions. The brain constantly compensates for these delays, adjusting perception to maintain a coherent sense of time. Occasionally, this compensation can overshoot or misalign, causing a temporal inversion in subjective experience. What you perceive as an early arrival of sound may, in part, be the brain's attempt to synchronize sensory input with predictive models. The auditory system is so finely tuned that even millisecond discrepancies can be interpreted as an actual reversal of cause and effect, producing the sensation of hearing before hearing. Psychological factors, particularly expectation and emotional salience, play a critical role. When you are anticipating a question, waiting for instructions, or emotionally invested in a conversation, the brain's predictive machinery is on high alert. This heightened state can make pre-activation of auditory representations unusually strong, converting the abstract anticipation of sound into a perceptual experience. The result is indistinguishable from hearing, complete with tonal quality, rhythm, and timbre. The mind experiences it as an external event, rather than a mental prediction, because the predictive circuits interface directly with sensory cortices in a way that simulates reality. Environmental cues and context also contribute. Slight air movements, posture shifts, or visual glimpses of the speaker's mouth can provide unconscious temporal markers that the brain uses to model imminent speech. The richer the context, the more precise the prediction, and the more convincing the reverse echo. The effect is enhanced in quiet or controlled environments, where external noise does not mask the pre-activated auditory representation, making the perception feel unambiguously real. Neuropsychological and physiological conditions can increase susceptibility. Migraines, temporal lobe activity, epilepsy, sleep deprivation, or transient disruptions in auditory processing can all amplify predictive misfires, making reverse echoes more frequent or pronounced. Even minor fatigue or stress can lower the threshold for the brain to convert prediction into perception, demonstrating how finely balanced auditory experience is between expectation and reality. The phenomenon underscores how perception is an active, constructive process, dependent not only on external stimuli, but on internal modeling and attentional resources. Culturally and psychologically, reverse echoes resonate with the human fascination with precognition, telepathy, and the bending of temporal norms. Stories of people anticipating speech, hearing premonitory words, or sensing events before they occur mirror this sensory illusion, lending it a mystical or uncanny aura. The experience feels inexplicably meaningful because it appears to subvert the ordinary rules of time, creating a momentary sense of extrasensory insight or foreknowledge. Ultimately, reverse echoes reveal the astonishing predictive sophistication of the human brain. Hearing someone's voice before they actually speak is not a literal bending of physics, but a window into the mechanisms by which perception, attention, memory, and expectation converge to create reality. The mind constantly anticipates the immediate future, and occasionally these anticipations manifest as perceptual events themselves, so convincing that they feel as if time has folded. The phenomenon is both ordinary and extraordinary, a fleeting misalignment in the machinery of auditory cognition that evokes wonder, unease, and a profound awareness of how perception constructs the flow of time and experience itself. Dream bleed. You wake up, carry on through the morning, and suddenly something in the world catches your attention. A phrase someone says, fleeting image in a store window, a pattern in the wallpaper, and it feels uncannily familiar, like it has already occurred. You realize with a shiver that it appeared in last night's dream. The conversation, the object, the arrangement of light or shadow, the subtle gesture of a stranger, all echoing exactly as you remember imagining them while asleep. This is dream bleed, the phenomenon where elements from the dream world seep into waking perception, creating a surreal overlap between the internal landscape of sleep and the external reality of the day. The experience is disorienting because it violates the usual boundary between imagination and perception, and forces the mind to confront the continuity of consciousness across the sleeping and waking states. The underlying mechanisms are rooted in the architecture of memory and perception. During REM sleep, the brain engages in intense neural activity in regions responsible for emotion, visual processing, and associative memory. The prefrontal cortex, the area governing logical sequencing and critical evaluation, is relatively subdued, which allows for the hallucinatory, often illogical narratives of dreams to unfold. The traces of these vivid dream experiences are stored in episodic memory alongside memories of real-world events. Normally, the brain can distinguish between imagined experiences and lived experiences, tagging memories with contextual markers such as temporal location and source, but sometimes this tagging fails or becomes fuzzy, causing dream content to resurface in waking perception as if it were external reality. A phrase, a gesture, a visual detail is no longer just a memory of an internal simulation. It appears as though the dream itself has subtly altered the fabric of the world we now inhabit. The phenomenon is amplified by the brain's predictive coding system. Our mind constantly anticipates sensory input, filling in gaps based on expectation and past experience. When a dream's content overlaps with waking stimuli through shape, sound, pattern, or context, the brain interprets it as confirmation, creating a momentary blurring between dreamed and real. The effect is particularly striking with details that are emotionally charged or unusual, because these are encoded more vividly during sleep. The brain's pattern recognition machinery, honed to detect anomalies in the environment, interprets these coincidences not as chance but as a continuation of the dream reality, producing the uncanny sensation of bleed. The more unexpected the waking echo, the more intense the perceptual and emotional impact. Attention and emotional salience also play a crucial role. Dreams often involve heightened emotional experiences, from fear and anxiety to wonder and exhilaration. These emotional intensities make the dream's content more sticky, increasing the likelihood that fragments will intrude into waking consciousness. When a dreamed image, phrase, or event is encountered in the real world, it triggers recognition circuits in the brain, sometimes accompanied by a rush of déjà vu, a shiver of uncertainty, or a surge of curiosity. The mind interprets the overlap as meaningful because emotionally salient stimuli are weighted more heavily in cognitive processing, creating the impression that the dream has projected itself into reality rather than simply recalling a memory. The neurochemical environment of sleep further primes the brain for dream bleed. During REM, acetylcholine levels are elevated, enhancing cortical plasticity and sensory simulation, while norepinephrine, which mediates alertness and critical evaluation, is suppressed. This allows dreams to unfold in vivid detail, often with intense visual, auditory, and spatial elements. Upon waking, the sudden reintroduction of full prefrontal activity and heightened norepinephrine can create a temporal mismatch between memory and perception. The brain suddenly receives both the residual sensory imprint of the dream and the real-world stimulus. And the overlap can generate the sensation that the dream is not confined to the night, but is actively manifesting in the day. Environmental factors can exacerbate the effect. Lighting, patterns, sounds, or subtle environmental cues can match details from dreams, triggering the brain to overlay remembered dream content onto real-world perception. A slant of morning sunlight on a desk, a fleeting pedestrian gesture, color combination in a cafe, all can act as anchors for dream fragments, making the bleed feel immediate and tangible. The brain treats these correspondences as evidence, effectively confirming the dream's intrusion into reality, even if the match is partial or coincidental. Culturally and psychologically, dream bleed has fascinated humans for millennia. Folklore, spiritual traditions, and literature often describe dreams as portals to other worlds or premonitions, and the phenomenon resonates with this archetype. A fragment of a dream appearing in waking life can feel like a message, a warning, or a synchronicity, especially when it aligns with emotionally significant events. Even without mystical interpretation, experience underscores the permeability of the boundaries between internal mental landscapes and external reality, revealing the brain's capacity to blur perception, memory, and imagination in ways that feel profoundly real. The phenomenon also highlights the fragility and reconstructive nature of memory. Dreamed experiences, though ephemeral, are stored alongside waking experiences in overlapping neural circuits. When waking stimuli resemble dream content, the brain can misattribute the source, a form of source monitoring error, creating the uncanny feeling that the world itself is echoing or continuing the dream. The effect can be subtler: gesture, a phrase, or striking a person, object, or a scenario appearing almost exactly as in the dream, because the brain seeks coherence. These intrusions are interpreted as continuity rather than coincidence, producing a sense that the boundary between sleep and wakefulness has thinned even momentarily. Ultimately, dream bleed reveals the complex interplay between memory, perception, emotion, and expectation. It demonstrates that the waking world is not a purely objective arena, but a canvas on which the mind projects traces of internal experience. For a fleeting moment, the mind cannot distinguish between imagined and real, between night and day, between the private theater of dreams and the shared reality of the world. These moments are disorienting, uncanny, and mesmerizing, a reminder that consciousness is a fluid continuum, and that the experiences of sleep can, in subtle and astonishing ways, seep into the fabric of the world we walk through while awake. Strangers knowing you are walking down a street, through a market, or entering a cafe, and a voice calls your name. You turn, expecting a familiar face, and instead, you see a stranger. Their eyes light up with recognition. Their smile is warm, almost intimate, and they greet you as though you have shared memories, private jokes, or long conversations together. They insist that you have met before, recounting details that feel oddly specific, yet you have no recollection of ever seeing them. The encounter is brief but unnervingly vivid, leaving your mind racing to reconcile the stranger's certainty with your own memory. This phenomenon, the sense of strangers knowing you, occupies a peculiar intersection of social cognition, memory, and perceptual expectation, creating a moment that is both familiar and profoundly disorienting. At the root lies the extraordinary sensitivity of human social perception. Our brains are wired to detect faces, read expressions, and identify individuals with remarkable precision. Specialized regions such as the fusiform face area allow us to recognize friends, acquaintances, and even fleeting strangers in a crowd. Social recognition is reinforced by the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, which encode not only identity, but emotional significance, context, and prior interactions. When a stranger projects confidence and warmth, signaling familiarity, the brain attempts to reconcile this with stored social memory. If the brain cannot find a matching memory trace, the result is cognitive dissonance, a deeply unsettling mismatch between social expectation and factual recollection. Memory itself is highly reconstructive rather than a literal recording of events. The stranger may use cues, body language, tone, shared physical context, or even subtle gestures to evoke a sense of familiarity. These cues can be interpreted by the brain as evidence of prior interaction, even if no such interaction occurred. This is partly why the phenomenon feels so real. Social memory is associative, linking people with emotions, places, and experiences. A stranger's insistence may activate neural circuits that normally respond to genuine recognition, producing the physiological and emotional resonance of having known them before. The brain interprets their confidence as corroboration, creating the eerie impression of past acquaintance where none exists. Expectation and attentional bias amplify the effect, Humans constantly generate predictions about social environments, anticipating who might appear, how interactions will unfold, and which social scripts will be enacted. A stranger approaching with certainty disrupts this predictive coding. The brain, confronted with confident signals of recognition, momentarily suspends disbelief, searching for patterns or explanations to reduce the mismatch between prediction and input. In essence, the mind experiences the stranger as known because it is easier, cognitively and emotionally, to assume prior familiarity than to process the anomaly of a confident unknown. Neuropsychological conditions provide insight into the underlying mechanisms. Certain disorders, including temporal lobe, epilepsy, migraine auras, schizophrenia, or brief dissociative states, can alter the processing of familiarity and recognition. Capgras delusion, for instance, involves a disconnect between facial recognition and the emotional response normally associated with that recognition, highlighting the delicate interplay between cognition and affect in identifying others. In the case of strangers knowing you, the phenomenon may be an inversion. The brain circuits for recognition and emotional resonance are hyperactivated or misaligned, producing a false sense of familiarity instead of indifference or misidentification. Even in healthy individuals, transient disruptions in attentional focus, fatigue, or heightened emotional states can enhance susceptibility to these uncanny social illusions. Environmental and contextual factors contribute as well. Crowded or noisy spaces, dim lighting, or shared situational cues can make a stranger seem more familiar than they are. Our brains rely on subtle cues: clothing, hairstyle, posture, scent, or even accent to anchor social recognition. When these cues partially match stored representations of previous acquaintances or archetypal social figures, the brain may generate a false sense of prior connection. The stranger's confident behavior acts as a reinforcing signal, solidifying the impression. This feedback loop can be so compelling that even repeated questioning fails to dispel the perception. Emotion is central to the experience. Warmth, confidence, and insistence from the stranger trigger limbic circuits associated with trust, safety, and social bonding. Oxytocin release may subtly reinforce the sense of familiarity, and the fight or flight systems respond to the anomaly. Curiosity mingles with unease, intrigue with suspicion. The encounter is emotionally salient, precisely because it violates the implicit assumption that recognition and familiarity are grounded in actual shared history. The psychological impact lingers long after the stranger departs, often haunting memory with an unresolved tension, the vividness of recognition contrasted with the certainty of unfamiliarity. Culturally, the phenomenon resonates with myths, folklore, and literature. Tales of mysterious acquaintances, spirits assuming familiar forms, or strangers with hidden knowledge mirror this uncanny experience, reinforcing its salience. Human cognition is predisposed to find narrative meaning in anomalous social events. The mind searches for explanations beyond ordinary perception, sometimes invoking fate, parallel realities, or subtle psychic connections, even without supernatural interpretation. The encounter exposes the brain's extraordinary sensitivity to social signals and its propensity to construct meaning from minimal input. Ultimately, strangers knowing you illuminate the intricate mechanics of social cognition and the fragility of memory. Recognition is not a simple lookup of past encounters, but an active, constructive process involving visual cues, emotional resonance, contextual associations, and predictive coding. When these systems misalign or overinterpret external signals, the result is an experience that feels authentic, yet impossible. The phenomenon is compelling, unsettling, and unforgettable because it exposes the hidden scaffolding of social perception, a network of expectation, memory, emotion, and prediction that ordinarily keeps us grounded in familiar social reality. For a few brief moments, the world tilts, and someone we have never met can feel as intimately known as a lifelong friend, leaving the mind to grapple with the impossible intimacy of the unknown made suddenly familiar. Ghost sounds. You are alone in a quiet house, the soft hum of appliances in the background, or walking down an empty street when a sound slices through the silence. Your name called aloud, clear and precise, yet unmistakably coming from nowhere. There is no one nearby, no source of amplification, no trick of the wind, no phone notification, or recording to account for it. The sensation is jarring, immediate, and deeply personal, as if a voice has reached directly into your consciousness. These are ghost sounds, a phenomenon where familiar auditory patterns, often voices, whispers, or even your own name, seem to manifest independently of any physical source. They are fleeting, often subtle, yet leave a lasting impression, challenging the listener's sense of reality and perception. The experience of hearing one's name or other ghostly sounds arises from the complex interplay between auditory perception, tension, memory, and expectation. The human auditory system is extraordinarily sensitive to patterns and frequencies associated with speech, particularly those tied to social relevance, such as one's own name. The brain prioritizes the detection of these signals because, evolutionarily, recognizing a name or a familiar voice could indicate the presence of kin, allies, or potential threats. Even in the absence of external sound waves, the auditory cortex, in collaboration with the prefrontal and temporal regions, can generate internally consistent percepts of familiar sounds when certain neural conditions align. In other words, the mind can hear in a way that feels identical to real auditory input. Predictive coding plays a central role in ghost sounds. The brain constantly anticipates sensory input based on context, memory, and expectation. When attention is focused on social relevance, solitude, or uncertainty, the auditory system is hypervigilant. Ambiguous auditory stimuli, a creak of a floorboard, the hum of a distant appliance, a shifting breeze can be interpreted as speech or a calling voice. The brain fills in gaps to match expected patterns, generating the illusion of a name being spoken. This is not mere imagination. The neural circuits involved in processing real sound and expected sound overlap, creating a percept so vivid it is often indistinguishable from genuine auditory experience. Physiological and emotional arousal amplify the phenomenon. Sudden silence, darkness, or isolation triggers the autonomic nervous system, heightening attention, sensory sensitivity, and readiness to respond to potential threats. Heart rate quickens, pupils dilate, and auditory pathways become more finely tuned. This hypervigilance increases the likelihood that minor, normally unnoticed environmental cues are interpreted as significant sound. Even subtle changes in airflow, mechanical vibrations, or distant echoes can be magnified and interpreted as a voice calling from nowhere. The effect is reinforced by fear, surprise, or anticipation, creating a feedback loop that intensifies both the clarity and emotional impact of the perceived sound. Memory and selective attention contribute as well. The human mind is inclined to encode unusual or emotionally salient events more vividly than ordinary ones. Ghost sounds are highly memorable precisely because they violate expectation and carry personal relevance, such as the calling of one's own name. Subsequent reflection often reconstructs the event, filling in missing elements and amplifying the perception of clarity or proximity, creating the impression of an external, purposeful source, even when the initial stimulus was ambiguous or generated internally. Neurologically, auditory hallucinations, including ghost sounds, may involve interactions between the temporal lobes, the auditory cortex, and the limbic system. These networks integrate perception, memory, and emotional salience. Occasionally, spontaneous neural activity in these regions produces internally generated sounds that the brain interprets as external. The phenomenon highlights the brain's intricate balancing act, distinguishing between internal thought, memory, recall, and sensory input. When that boundary blurs, the experience is subjectively indistinguishable from hearing a voice in reality. Cultural and psychological frameworks enhance the resonance of ghost sounds. Across societies, unexplained auditory phenomena have been interpreted as spirits, presences, or messages from beyond. The calling of one's name is especially potent, carrying symbolic weight and emotional significance. In modern contexts, ghost sounds still evoke the uncanny, bridging the gap between the known and unknown, the internal and external. Even without invoking supernatural interpretation, the experience taps into deep cognitive and emotional pathways, producing a sense of personal connection and disquieting immediacy. Ultimately, ghost sounds reveal the remarkable sensitivity and interpretive power of human perception. They demonstrate that consciousness is not a passive recorder of the external world, but an active constructor of sensory reality, capable of generating perceptual experiences indistinguishable from actual stimuli. The auditory system, tuned by evolution to detect socially relevant cues, can produce phenomena that feel both immediate and impossible, blurring the boundary between external reality and internal expectation. In these moments, a voice from nowhere becomes both a mirror of the mind's anticipatory mechanisms and a reminder of the fragile interface between perception, memory, and the uncanny mysteries that surround human awareness. The observer feeling you are sitting alone in a dimly lit room, scrolling through your phone, or perhaps lying in bed as the house settles around you. The silence is punctuated only by distant sounds, the faint hum of a refrigerator, the soft creak of floorboards, the subtle whisper of air moving through a ventanette. Amid this ordinary quiet, a startling sensation arises, the unnerving conviction that someone, somewhere, is watching you. The feeling is precise, localized, almost tactile, as if an invisible pair of eyes is trained directly upon you, scrutinizing your every movement. Your skin prickles, your muscles tighten, your breath catches. The observer feeling is unlike a fleeting moment of paranoia. It is a full-bodied, immersive awareness. It's convincing enough to trigger the same physiological and psychological responses that real observation would provoke. The phenomenon originates in the brain's extraordinary sensitivity to social cues and the evolutionary imperatives that underlie it. Humans are highly attuned to the gaze, orientation, and subtle behaviors of others. Detecting even the slightest hint of attention from another being was essential for survival in ancestral environments, alerting one to predators, rival groups, or social evaluation. Neural circuits specialized for detecting biological motion and gaze direction centered in the superior temporal sulcus, amygdala, and parietal cortices operate largely beneath conscious awareness, constantly scanning for cues that another agent is present. When you are alone and input is minimal, these circuits can generate a false positive, interpreting subtle environmental irregularities like shadows, shifts in lighting, or even internal somatic signals as evidence of an observer. Predictive coding amplifies the intensity of the feeling. The brain is not merely reactive, continuously forecasts what sensory input it expects to receive. In contexts of perceived vulnerability, darkened rooms, unfamiliar spaces, or late-night solitude, the predictive systems are hyperactive. They anticipate potential threats, scanning for patterns that indicate the presence of others. If a sound, movement, or change in air pressure aligns, however subtly, with these predictions, the brain constructs a perceptual experience of observation, imbuing ordinary environmental cues with extraordinary significance. Even micro-changes in peripheral vision or ambient noise can be integrated into a compelling illusion of being watched. Physiological arousal heightens the uncanny intensity. The autonomic nervous system, responding to the perception of threat, releases adrenaline and noradrenaline, sharpening senses, accelerating heartbeat, and priming muscles for defensive action. This hypervigilance makes every sound, shadow, or reflection disproportionately significant. It creates a feedback loop. Heightened arousal makes the environment feel more alive, and the environment's subtle stimuli reinforce the sense of being observed. Even the brain's own internal noise, subtle electrical activity, microtremors of the body, or involuntary eye movements can be misinterpreted as external presence, further feeding the uncanny perception. Memory and attention also play pivotal roles. The observer feeling is vividly encoded precisely because it violates ordinary expectations of safety and privacy. The mind tags the event as emotionally significant, retaining it with unusual clarity. In retrospect, mundane environmental coincidences, such as a curtain fluttering or a shadow shifting, are imbued with meaning, reinforcing the sense that the experience was extraordinary and real. This selective memory process makes the phenomenon appear more frequent or consistent than it objectively is, creating the impression of persistent, inexplicable observation. Cultural and symbolic frameworks magnify the effect. Tales of invisible watchers, spirits, or otherworldly presences pervade folklore, literature, and media, shaping expectations and interpretation. When alone, especially in contexts associated with fear or suspense, the brain may interpret ambiguous sensory input through the lens of these narratives, producing the sensation of intentional observation. Mirrors, windows, or reflective surfaces can accentuate the experience, as they offer a literal framework for watching and being watched, even in the absence of a physical observer. Neuroscientific research links the phenomenon to the temporoparietal junction, prefrontal cortex, and limbic system, regions involved in agency detection, self-other distinction, and threat processing. When these systems misfire or overpredict the presence of external agents, they create the compelling illusion that someone is observing, even in empty space. The observer feeling is, in essence, a hyper-realized simulation generated by the brain, a moment when perception, expectation, and emotion converge to produce an experience indistinguishable from reality. The phenomenon reveals the adaptive sophistication of human consciousness, demonstrates that the mind is constantly projecting, interpreting, and modeling the presence of others to maintain survival. Social awareness and environmental vigilance. The uncanny potency of the observer feeling lies in its ability to convince the body and mind that attention exists where none does, to elicit genuine physiological responses to a phantom presence, and to leave a lasting emotional imprint. It is simultaneously a testament to the brain's predictive precision and a reminder of its susceptibility to misperception, illustrating that consciousness is not merely a passive recorder of reality, but an active constructor of experience. In these moments, the boundaries between self, environment, and perception become fluid. The feeling of being watched when alone is more than a quirk of imagination. It is an intimate encounter with the mechanisms by which the brain navigates uncertainty, constructs agency, and interprets the invisible. It reminds us that the human mind is exquisitely tuned to detect presence and meaning. It's capable of generating profound, immersive experiences that blur the line between reality and perception, leaving the observer simultaneously terrified, awed, and acutely aware of their own embodied existence within the unseen world.